pretty sure we've got either in person or online. My name's Tom Raines. I'm the co-chair of the committee along with Maureen Kane. And I want to thank you all for being here Monday morning. We've got a pretty robust agenda, so it's best we get rolling. Just a couple of real quick, maybe housekeeping things. As we move through the morning, rather than doing complete introductions right now, if someone is going to speak, we're going to ask that you introduce yourself and which entity or where you're coming from in terms of membership or speaking. That will help us all as we move through the day. Generally, obviously, everybody knows this was put together pretty quickly, and it's been a fluid experience, but I think we're pretty well put together now structurally. These are public meetings and will be treated as such. In the last week or so, there have been emails going around that we now have the website posted. We have some dates set. Obviously, we may need to add more dates. So if anyone is looking at the current calendar and sees 2 dates in January, be not afraid. That will not be the last date. We will have more, whether you like it or not. But I think we're going to have more to accomplish our work. In terms of this morning, we've got a lot to accomplish. We're going to have some great public testimony and input today. I'm looking forward to hearing that. Maureen, I don't know if you have anything you want to add before we get going.
No, I think we can get started with Barrick and their presentation. We do start public testimony at 10. We have 9 people signed up for this session. So most of them community representatives. We do have a robust list also for next week on the 18th. So I asked the public testimony to start at 10 o'clock. But if you have people or names of people that you want to testify next week or at a subsequent meeting, if we need to add another one, just let us know. Thanks. Bye.
All right. Well, thank you all. My name is Barrick Abramson with Confluence. We're here to facilitate. We're going to start on some presentations at 9:15, starting with a presentation by Jack Reed from the Department of Public Safety. But since, as Tom mentioned, this is moving at such a breakneck pace, we want to spend just a few minutes up front. So I'm going to spend the next 8 minutes or so. If anybody just wants to offer kind of their big takeaway or reflection from our meeting a week ago, with the big caveat, I'm going to really ask everybody to keep this to a lightning round of 30 to 60 seconds. And what I will do is go around the room and call on folks. If you don't feel you have something to add, that is absolutely okay. But I want to make sure everybody gets the opportunity. And I'm going to start to my right with Matt Lunn.
Thank you, Barrick. Matt Lunn, Director for the Division of Criminal Justice. I was out of town on a work trip, so I don't have a 30-second bite from the last meeting, but I appreciate the opportunity to say hi.
All right. And Director Hilke, any thoughts for this group? Thank you. Mr. Chavez.
No, I can pass as well. Thank you.
We are storming right through. Representative Weissman.
I feel like I'm not allowed to pass, but I'll just say briefly, it was pretty encouraging. I mean, I think preliminary, but I think there was some candor about the challenge ahead and some important agreements to start setting up some wireframe for how to deal with that.
Thank you, Mr. Weissman. Janet.
Good morning, everyone. Janet Drake from the Attorney General's office. I'm grateful that we're all here together and working collaboratively, and I appreciated that the last time we really set the table and now we can start the feast. Thanks.
Wonderful. And I think people will be eating quite a bit at this feast table today. For those of you online, if you're a member of this group, we would ask if you're in a place to do so, that it's safe. We ask that you turn your camera on. If you're a member of the public, we do ask that you leave your camera off throughout, although we will have a time for public comment at the end of the meeting. But want to make sure that this group has the opportunity to really engage with one another. Tom.
Just briefly, I'm encouraged by the collaboration so far, and I know we've got a great group of people working on this, so looking forward to all of it.
Maureen.
I agree with Tom, so I'll pass.
Jamie. At this rate, I think we're going to get through a lot of meetings. I hope the decisions come this easily. Jason.
I agree with Tom.
Vincent.
Hi, good morning. Vincent Atch to you with Mental Health Colorado, and nothing further to add. looking forward to working with you all.
Great. And I am going to go online and I will call on Senator Gardner, but then for the rest of the members, I'm going to ask you to raise your hand online if you do have something to add. Otherwise, we'll just move forward. But Senator Gardner, it's good to see you.
Good to see all of you as well. Just quickly, I was very encouraged by the game plan we put together last session, and express my thanks to Maureen and Tom for keeping us on task, and look forward to working with our facilitators as well. Good morning, everyone.
Wonderful. And I see Emily and Senator Gonzalez and others online. Anybody online want to offer any reflections on our first meeting or thoughts as we go into today's conversation? Okay, well, in words I probably won't get to say often over the next few months, we are ahead of schedule, and I'm going to keep us plowing forward. The first thing we're going to do is go with a presentation from Jack Reed with the Department of Public Safety.
And I just want to, this is Maureen Kane. I want to offer apologies to Jack, and because I think we asked him Friday at 2:00 if he could present Monday at 9:15. So thanks, Jack.
Okay, there we go. Jack Reed, I'm the research director in the Division of Criminal Justice. And my office of Research and Statistics staffed the CCJJ. So I'm just going to do just a kind of a brief overview of how the CCJJ operated, who the members were, what our process was, and how recommendations came about, and then also just kind of like looking through some of the recommendations or recommendation topics that we had. So overview, I will say that Maureen's overview of crime commissions and sentencing commissions over the history of Colorado was amazing. Thank you for that. Now we have that, which is fantastic. So it was established in the 2007 session and began work in 2008. And just in that first session, the recommendations resulted in 7 bills. At that time, I worked with the sheriff of Arapahoe County, Grayson Robinson, on another committee, and he always spoke so highly of the CCJJ because it was a place where things got done, and that was actually the first time I'd ever heard of it. So it had a great reputation before, definitely before I even knew it existed, before I was here. So 75 bills were the direct result of CCJJ recommendations. And there were an average of about 5 bills per year over the time period of 2008 to 2023. That ranged from years with 1 to 2 years that actually had 10 bills that came from recommendations at the CCJJ. And I think there were roughly 300 different recommendations that came out. And the recommendations were there were legislative recommendations, there were policy recommendations, and there were business practice recommendations. If you all are interested and need to find out anything that the CCJJ did, the website is here, and it is an amazing resource. Literally pretty much every single document going back to 2008, any recommendation that you are interested in or any bill that came out of those recommendations is available, and that website will remain up. It's not going away. It will be effectively a repository for the foreseeable future, at least until, well, I don't know. It'll probably stay up forever. In 2013 and 2018, there was legislation that extended the CCJJ. And then last year, as you all know, the commission was sunsetted. And I think that the mission of the commission, really enhancing public safety, ensuring justice, and ensuring protection of the rights of victims through the cost-effective use of public resources, is, I think, something that the commission really tried to, in all of the work that it did, hold to that mission and really make sure that they were doing good work. I will cop to I'm obviously biased, but moving along. So membership in the commission was established by legislation. 13 were appointed by the governor, and they really represented a wide cross-section of the criminal and juvenile justice system. The chair and vice chair of the CCJJ were also chosen by the governor. 10 members, including one ex officio member, occupied specific positions in government, agencies, or boards. I'll actually have just kind of a list of the specifics regarding those positions in the next slide. 2 members were appointed by the judicial. One was the head of probation, the other was a judge. And then there were 4 members from the legislature, 2 from the House and 2 from the Senate. And then the head of the Colorado District Attorney's Council, Mr. Tom Raines, was a constant presence. And if you're interested at membership at the time of sunset, that's the link there. You can see who was on it at the very end. So when we look at who was actually, what were the roles? Like I said, there were 13 members appointed by the governor, and those really kind of span the gamut from people in behavioral health, those with lived experience in the justice system, several representatives of victims, a victim advocate, victims' rights organization, and a victim of crime, one person from the juvenile justice, a person from the defense bar, police department representative, and sheriff. We were fortunate enough to have Sheriff Fitzsimons as our sheriff representative. And there were also 2 at-large positions and a municipal representative. When it came to the representatives by virtue of their positions, the head executive directors of the Department of Public Safety, Corrections, Human Services, and Higher Education were all present. A representative from the Attorney General's office. The DCJ director was an ex officio member who did not have voting. Then there were representatives from the Juvenile Parole Board, State Board of Parole, the State Public Defender, a district attorney, CDAC, again, 2 from judicial, 2 representatives, and 2 senators. So how it kind of functioned from behind the scenes. So there was an independent consultant who offered facilitation, expertise, and guidance to the commission, to its subcommittees, task forces, and working groups. In the time of the commission, I believe there were 2 different consultants that had been engaged. Then my staff, DCJ staff, offered meeting organization and support. So we did prep with a consultant and leadership of commissions and task forces. We did logistics, so room, Zoom, setup, takedown, refreshments, IT, ensuring all meetings were posted and that we were complying with the open meetings law. And then the prepare, edit, and publish, which it's one sentence on this particular list, but I think that of all the work that the support staff of the commission did, and much like the support staff in the legislature here, I mean, they just did amazing work getting things, summarized, getting it up so that everyone had a really, really good sense of what the work of the CCJJ was going to be and what it had been. Then annual reports, archiving all materials so they could be found by anyone. Like I said, anything you want to find, whether it's a presentation or minutes, agendas, recommendations, anything is available. We also track the status of all recommendations. So if a recommendation became a bill, that's also available on our website. And in total, at the end, there were about 5 staff that, really kind of approximately 2.5 to 3.5 FTE, depending on the time of year and where we were at when it came to recommendations. We also conducted research on questions from the CCJJ and its various subgroups. My office is well placed because of our memos of understanding with judicial and CBI, and a really great relationship with DOC, where we were able to get data on and other types of research in a very efficient way that would not otherwise have easily been available. So commission priorities, how were they set? The first way that they were set was through legislative mandates. The first version of the CCJJ, well, the first establishment of it had minority overrepresentation as one of the priorities of the commission. And then over the years, there have been a number of CCJJ priorities that were set by legislation. Additionally, priorities could be set by the commission. There were retreats where issues that were facing the justice system were discussed, and priorities were voted on, and the actual work of the commission was oftentimes set by the 30 people at the table who had a wide variety of expertise in the justice system. And then starting after the 2018 1287 House bill, there was a biennial letter from the governor, and that really informed a lot of the recent work of the CCJJ. The Sentencing Reform Task Force really came as a result of that, as well as the Reentry Task Force. So at Sunset, this is basically what was going on at the CCJJ, I guess. The legislative subcommittee met as needed during the session to make sure that a bill that was coming out of a recommendation still met the spirit of the recommendation of the commission. There was a community corrections task force designed to determine if there were misdemeanants who may benefit from community corrections. There had been a pretrial release task force that was on hiatus. There was a very recently established reentry task force that was intended to look at, reentry from incarceration. And then I think probably the one that was doing the lion's share of the work over the last 2 years of the commission, Sentencing Reform Task Force. And that had, I think there were 4 different subgroups. Parole, which had kind of wrapped up its mandate by the time of sunsetting. And then the Sentencing Alternative Decisions and Probation Working Group, which really came out with a lot of great policy recommendations, in particular about probation. And then Sentence Progression Working Group, which was just looking at how does a person's how do they progress through their sentence, and is there a way to improve the efficiency of it as well as the effectiveness of it. That kind of effectively morphed into the reentry group. And then the one group that really I think had, when you look at if you look at the number of pages, the Sentence Structure Working Group definitely had did a lot of work, really fundamentally restructuring misdemeanor reform, doing restructuring of a large chunk of felonies. And then, you can go through the list of things that came out of that particular group at your leisure. But I think that that group really did an amazing amount of work. And, the working group did a lot, but then there was also a study group that worked together. I don't know how many meetings that they had. And Tom is laughing because I'm sure he can't count either. And Maureen. So, the work that came out of the study group then informed the work of the working group, which then informed the Sentencing Reform Task Force, which, there's a hole in the bottom of the sea. This is actually a list of the task forces and subcommittees that were established at the CCJJ over the period of its existence. I think that it really was the breadth of the topics that were covered in the commission is one that I think speaks very well to frankly the breadth of the membership. And I've already covered the ones that were working at the time of sunset. So really quickly, I know one thing that that was, I don't know.
Jack could.
Thank you. Yeah, I have some other questions and discussion that I'll hold, but just on that last slide, kind of incredible that I have a guess here, but I'm not 100% positive. Terminology difference for folks here and online who may not know. We have a list of task forces and subcommittees. I think of a subcommittee as being comprised of only members of the full CCJJ through the respective appointing authorities. Task forces often included outside folks, subject matter experts, important voices who were not themselves members of the full CCJJ. Correct understanding? Seeing nodding.
Yeah, that's accurate. And also Rep. Reisman, the working groups would have operated in a similar fashion sometimes.
I'm not sure though. Subcommittees may have had people that were outside of the commission on them as well, I believe. And we actually had working groups, task forces, subcommittees, and then there was even a time where we had small tiger teams. So we're pretty flexible in that regard.
Yeah, Stan, I think you are right.
Yeah.
As I look at the list of some of those subcommittees, there were certainly some non-commission members on those.
Yeah.
So
Okay. I mean,
deviated a little from.
I'll be honest. As a legislator, I never really got too much into what something was called, rather just what was the work product coming out of it, and was that being taken up into the legislative process or not. So, okay, maybe we shouldn't worry, or what I'm taking away from this brief discussion is we shouldn't worry too much about that terminology now, but rather that over the years, there were many different sub-entities with whatever name that broke off a specific piece of work and went to town on it. Okay.
Yeah, I agree with that as well. Because I'm just looking at the opioid investigation subcommittee. That was law enforcement. It wasn't really anybody else but law enforcement trying to look at those issues. That was a legislative subcommittee. So my experience was with anything below the commission itself always had some outside people. How they were selected was kind of, and eventually became problematic, I think.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you, Rep. Weissman. I will say that all of the links on here actually go to the work of those, and you can actually see the full membership as well as all of the recommendations that came out of those subcommittees or task forces. So quickly, the recommendation process, when we looked at how do we set our priorities, like I said, there was 3 ways for them to get set. Once those priorities were decided upon, the CCJJ would effectively say, okay, we need a task force or a subcommittee to work on this topic. And they would really set the makeup of the task force or the subcommittee. The chair or co-chair did have to be a CCJJ member. And they would give the task forces general guidance about the topics to address. So the task forces would begin their work, and really some of the first meetings, they would set the specific topics and prioritize them, and then kind of check back in with the commission to make sure that they were on the right path and that the commission kind of concurred with the specifics of the topics they were going to be exploring. Then the task force would create working groups, and these working groups were, again, much more specific around what was going to be accomplished. So the Sentencing Reform Task Force created the Structure Working Group, which really did the fundamental work on recommendations for sentencing reform. If taking this is where I guess the sausage was made, as it were, was really in that working group area, because that's where they did the research, they heard the presentations, and they really kind of crafted and wordsmithed a lot of the recommendations that were coming forward. And working groups really had, I think, the most focused subject matter experts on any specific topic. These working groups, they met, they did research, they heard presentations, they considered data, they debated, they compromised, etc. And then they proposed recommendations to the task forces. The task force would then hear those recommendations, they would hear additional research, they would bring in other experts, and would then look at the recommendations. They could approve them, or they could send them back with questions or suggested changes, or they could simply say, no, this is not something this task force wants to move forward on. And then once those were voted on, that was a majority vote. They were sent to the CCJJ. The CCJJ had a 2-part process. They would hear the recommendation, hear support from it, oftentimes have preliminary debates on the substance and merit of the recommendations, and then they'd be able to go back to their own stakeholders for comments and suggestions. And then at a second hearing, the CCJJ would again engage in additional debate and would vote on whether to accept, amend, reject, and ask the task force to consider additional work on those recommendations. And that was a super majority vote. And this is just a list of the topics that recommendations kind of, fell into. And, like I said, this is this covers a very wide range of the justice system. And I think, the breadth of this, again, is also a testament to the breadth of expertise of the folks on the commission. And I think that's all that I have. I just kind of wanted to keep it short. If you all have any questions, I would be glad to take them at this time.
Yeah, Representative Weissman.
Thank you. I guess first, Mr. Reed, just thank you for putting together that capsule history. So an interesting thing about CCJJ is it never had bill authority. It was not like a legislative interim committee in that sense. That was, in fact, something that we discussed in the 2018 sunset. I was sitting where the three of you are, and the Judiciary Committee was here. And for the record, judiciary members don't get a pass from their own committee. I certainly didn't on that bill, as Mr. Raines well knows. We debated whether it didn't become part of CCJJ going forward, obviously. Anyway, notwithstanding that, CCJJ had a pretty good track record about getting its ideas taken up into the legislative process through the Committee on Late Bills or otherwise. Not 100% though. I would find it interesting and maybe illuminating for our going forward purposes if I don't think that I've seen this tidily compiled in one place. I don't know if it's something that you and your staff at DPS could do feasibly, but there were concepts that went all the way through whatever task force, work group, subcommittee, the full CCJJ got the supermajority vote that was requisite, never made it into legislation. I think it's worth looking at that list. At least I'm interested. I'm not going to ask you to speculate on the why, and there often isn't one reason why. But one example is extraordinary risk sentencing was recommended by CCJJ for substantial modification, if not elimination, circa 2013, never found its way to legislation. Possibly because that was one of the more charged topics that ever could have come out of it. But that is one of the many sentence extenders or amplifiers that we have on the books that can lead to disparate outcomes. I don't mean to focus too much on that. It's just the one that sticks in my head. So would be interested if the department division specifically could kind of boil that down over all the years. And maybe it's not a big list that would speak to prior successes. Can I pivot then to a comment or?
Yeah.
Ms. Kane?
I just want to make a comment. Having been involved with CCJ since its initiation, not having bill titles was always difficult. Because interim committees did, but CCJJ. And often I was the one that was begging for bill titles from leadership. And when Speaker Ferrandino was Speaker of the House, he said CCJJ bills did not have to fit into the 5 that a legislator had. And that was his rule, but that changed with different speakers. And so as I just wanted to comment on that because you brought it up, Rep. Weissman, that not having a designated number of bill, which you can use or not use, but interim committees get them and the commission never did. So just to follow up on whether or not recommendations ever became legislation, that is tracked on the website. Yeah. It is tracked what recommendations became law, what recommendations for policy. But there was never ability or at CCJJ to do any follow-up on what, if it passed, what were the outcomes? Did that policy change result in the outcomes that you wanted? I think in the area of mental health diversion, that was a huge thing because we spent a lot of time with a task force on mental health and whether whether or not that group, which operated for a short period of time, had any impact. That is tracked as far as passing, but not how did it impact the system. So just wanted to comment on that.
Representative Weissman.
Thank you. A bit more on this. And Ms. Kane, I'm familiar with some of the pages of the website that I think organized more in a year over year, topic by topic way. What I haven't seen, and if it exists and I'm just straight missing it, somebody please set me straight, is kind of the whole thing over the 15 years boiled down. These never became law. And I know that there were recommendations that were not statutory in nature. So probably just drop those out of that analysis. I just, it might save us time versus going page by page and kind of scraping it all together, sir, if that is possible. To the point about bills, I'm realizing that I think a lot of us here are familiar with what all we're talking about, but maybe we should just unpack it for a few who may not be, and anybody listening in online. The way that interim committees work is they are approved for a set number of bills. 5 is common. I've seen fewer. Until a couple years ago, there wasn't a limit on the number that could be drafted. Picking on myself as an example, there was a 2017 interim committee on sentencing that was approved for 5 bills. We drafted 19 or 21. So executive committee, I think, with an appropriate eye toward managing capacity of our nonpartisan staff, at some point imposed a 2 times limit. So if a committee is approved for 5 bills, you can draft not more than 10. And the committee members may have to make some tough choices about that. This place is about tough choices. Conversely, if a committee is approved for 3, either in the statute or if it's a letter committee, then you get to draft 6 and so on. And then you make the final cut, which of the half that I had drafted you don't have to draft all the 10, but say I chaired a committee this year on taxes. We drafted 10, we get to do 5, and we had to pick, frankly. So that is a bit of existing law, if you will, for the legislature as set forth in our rules. And if we were to recommend structure or structures with drafting authority, that would sort of be the baseline that I think we'd be starting from. Now, we could discuss what it is to depart from that, but I guess I just put that out there in the interest of context and transparency. And then if I could just roll into one last comment here, this is not a question for Mr. Reed. One of the things that we're going to discuss later, and that I've certainly heard from interested stakeholders, is the question of one entity, multiple entities, one group, multiple groups. It's interesting that the prior structure of TCJJ is effectively both. You have, if you will, the super committee, the permanent membership, changing over time as people need to rotate out. But then the real work was done in the task force or working group structure. Outside folks were pulled in. Certainly the latter, I think, tracks more with how the legislature tends to create things in a more short-term way by, we might use different words. We might call it a task force. We might call it a work group, whatever, but we charge a specific group to do a specific thing, really for one interim, maybe 2. Anyway, I'll leave that there for now and look forward to coming back to that later. Thank you.
Director Hilke.
Thanks, Tom. This is more comments than questions for Jack. Jack, thank you for the presentation. For those that are in the room or online listening, the presentation almost made that seem stress-free. And I can tell you, as having been the chair of that for 9 years, the type of work that is being done versus how the work got done and the heavy lifting, I want to make sure the committee understands that. And the reason that I think that is because it's important when we make recommendations about what it looks like, that any future group is properly staffed and has the horsepower to do the work behind the scenes. And I'll just say, and I kind of ratify what Representative Weisman just said, is that the commission itself did important work, but the real heavy lift was done in the task forces and the working groups. And they were meeting twice a month, if not more, in between commission meetings. And at the end was actually for sure a lot more than twice a month. And, that's a lot to ask of volunteers. In the week prior to the commission meeting, just in public safety where the administrative functions sat, we had a week of meetings. My calendar was full of meetings that were planning for the commission meeting, planning for the subcommittee and task force meetings, and having the task force meetings that actually themselves. And the consultants were, deeply involved with that as well. And I only mention that because, again, I don't want us to forget about putting the muscle behind this work, because it needs a lot of that muscle that it goes on behind the scenes and is really, almost invisible to the commission members in many ways. I'll also clarify that the biennial letter came out of the sunset process in 17, I think. Anyway, I don't remember, 18. And it did require the governor to consult with ledge leadership and the chief justice to come up with those priorities. I will also say, and I think this is important, that be prepared. The speed of consensus in the criminal justice system is slow. And, one of the things that concerns me, only from a standpoint of trying to make sure that we do get stuff done, is that a lot of times in an interim committee, you have one session to get that done. And I worry about the speed of consensus being able to pace on the pace of the legislature. I think that's going to be really difficult. And I think Maureen mentioned one other issue there is that the appointments of people to the commission itself, the task forces, the working groups, always became in many cases, not always, subject to controversy. That's a difficult job in itself, finding people that are willing to serve, finding people who actually then, or say they will, but then never show up and never show up to do any of the work is just difficult because you're asking volunteers who are pulling people from extremely busy jobs. Two other things: don't forget the open meetings, all the open meetings laws. They become more important in this world than they are in all the other commissions and public meetings that I sit on. This one seems to be the one that really is the most important because it's where people will cry the biggest foul. And I think we need to make sure that we understand what that looks like as well. And then finally, this is speaking to also what Rep. Wiseman talked about with bill work. We didn't have bill authority or title authority or whatever. The commission did not have even its own legislative liaison. In the Department of Public Safety, we did. And so unstructured in a way, we endeavored to try to help push that and prosecute the getting a sponsor and all that kind of stuff, but it was always a little bit uncomfortable. And so, anything that can be done or recommended that overcomes that challenge, I think is important. But, bringing together, the biggest thing from my perspective as a chair, bringing together people and getting to a place of consensus usually takes a period of time of unpacking years of transgressions against each other before you actually start talking and being productive. And I think that's one of the things that is the easiest to discount when we think about what a new group would look like. Thanks, Tom.
Great. Thank you. I want to thank both members for their comments, but I want to kind of get us back on track. Thank Mr. Reed again, who has a comment.
Thank you, Tom. To Director Hilke's point, in the last fiscal year, there were almost 50 meetings, formal posted meetings of the CCJJ, its task forces and working groups.
Great. Thank you. So I think we can all hear that we're just peeling back layer one of the onion. And we're going to dive into the significant issues of any group, which are the composition and inclusion, and then the process and structure. So it's going to be a busy day. It's going to be a busy month.
It absolutely is. And Rep. Weissman, just to address some of your points and some of what Director Hilke brought up this afternoon, we'll have a brief conversation just to introduce what are some of the work streams that we need to tackle, from the structure to the mission to what are the authorities and all of those details. And some of what we want to address this afternoon is not answering those, but is really getting into what are the narrow pieces that we need to address and what is the sequencing that this group would like to approach that so that we're allowing the form and the mission to inform the function rather than getting that inverted and focusing on one piece first. What I want to do next, though, is share some information about other states. And as I do this, something I want to emphasize is that this is not intended to be an exhaustive examination of states or a presentation to say this state has it right and therefore we should look at this model. What we wanted to do was look at a representative set of states that are approaching this work differently, from basing it in the legislature to inside a department or agency to some that place it with the governor's office and how some of these structure it. I'm going to be going through very quickly. We will share this and post this overview. Again, this is a summary. We have another 25-page document that backs all this up that we're happy to circulate. What we wanted to do was just use this to start the conversation about how some different states are approaching it. So this group can think about that and give us some guidance on where you'd like to go a little more deeply. One thing I will highlight, some folks asked us about Montana. In the world of technology controlling all, state of Montana websites have been down for at least the last 8 days. So we did not want to pull information that we don't know is current. And the other thing I will say is everything here is from official state websites. And some of them I can tell you have not been updated in at least 5 years. So we're going with the most recent information states have published. We also spent some time with NCSL, the National Conference of State Legislature, and with the National Sentencing Conference folks. But what we want from you is just to give us feedback on where you'd like to go deeper with any of these. I'm going to start with Illinois, and Illinois, like a number of states, has 2 different councils or commissions. They've got the Juvenile Justice Commission, as well as the Sentencing Policy Advisory Council. They did also have a commission on criminal justice and sentencing reform that had a specific set of tasks charged with developing comprehensive evidence-based strategies to meet the goal of reducing Illinois' prison population. That was dissolved in 2015 upon their submission of their final report. As I talk a lot about different juvenile justice commissions, I also want to distinguish those from the state advisory groups, the Juvenile Justice and Diversion Program Councils, which stem from a federal piece of legislation and funding. So we've got separate JJDP councils in most states, in addition to these commissions that we're talking about. And you'll see here that in the case, what's that?
I just want to say, Barrick, I appreciate you going through this quickly. If we can't finish, because I do want to start testimony at 10 o'clock, we'll do it at 12. Okay.
Understood.
So,
Yes.
because I think this is
Stop it.
important stuff. Thanks.
Agreed.
Observation. Can you email this out to us so we can see it?
We absolutely, we will post this on the website and we will email it to all members.
All right, thanks. I didn't want this to be the last time that we see it.
No, sir.
All right.
So you see, in the case of the Illinois Juvenile Justice Commission, there's 25 members who are appointed by the governor. In that case, they're serving 3-year terms. They, to the point of some of the conversations we're having, have a number of committees, executive, planning and grants, racial justice and equity. They have ad hoc work groups, one on compliance and one specifically on youth engagement. Illinois also has their separate sentencing policy advisory council. And I think it's important to note that that one reports directly to the Assembly, the Supreme Court, and the governor, but they do not make recommendations or take positions on specific legislation. That one is a group of 23 state and local members of their community. And the purpose of their sentencing policy advisory council, which you'll see across many states is similar, is to review sentencing policies and practices and examine how those policies and practices impact the criminal justice system as a whole. And again, we will share this out, and I'm happy to come back with more information. I just want to make sure we do stop at 10 o'clock. But looking at Kansas, they similarly have 2 different committees or commissions. They have the Juvenile Justice Oversight Committee, which is a statutorily defined team of stakeholders of youth-serving systems. They were during COVID and changing membership, they took the opportunity at that point to rethink their structure. And in 2022 and 23, they continue to embrace a revised structure, making commitment to quarterly Juvenile Justice Oversight Committee meetings with using a lot of different subcommittees who met monthly. They adopted a new mission, and some of their subcommittees include data, communications, reinvestment, and they have a dedicated legislative committee. Kansas also has a separate sentencing commission who develop post-implementation monitoring procedures and reporting methods to evaluate guideline sentences, advise and consult with the Secretary of Corrections and members of the legislature in developing a mechanism to link guidelines, sentence practices with correctional resources and policies. Their stated purpose is that the 17 members exist, and after it was fully formed and staffed in November of '89, the commission initially met semi-monthly in Topeka. The commission decided early on, though, to confine their activities to adult felony sentences. And the commission further identified a set of goals to be attained in developing a uniform sentencing guideline system. Outside of that, Kansas has a pretty broad mission and scope, or ambiguous as it is in statute anyway. In Kentucky, they similarly have 2 separate bodies. The Juvenile Justice Oversight Council, which is a statutory committee. They provide independent review of the state juvenile justice system and directly provide recommendations to the General Assembly. They're housed within the Kentucky General Assembly. It contains 6 legislative members who are non-voting, 12 citizen members, 3 legislative staff members, which includes 2 analysts and 1 committee assistant. And I'm highlighting some of that to Director Hilke and Jack's comments about the number of staff. You'll see some of these range from all volunteer to you're going to see some that have more than a dozen FTEs assigned. The Kansas Sentencing Commission's purpose is to develop post-implementation monitoring procedures. They consist of 17 members. I'm sorry, I've got a double paste there. I will correct that for you. Moving to Nevada, who also has the Juvenile Justice Oversight Commission and a separate sentencing commission. I think one thing in particular to highlight under the Nevada Sentencing Commission is that the commission studied other sentencing commissions and ultimately recommended that it become independent of the legislature, be provided dedicated staff to assist in analyzing and overseeing criminal justice data. The legislature adopted that recommendation in 2019. Looking back up at their juvenile justice, they're a group of representatives from juvenile justice and those in the community. The state of Nevada applied for and received technical assistance through the Justice Center of the Council of State Governments. And that award triggered a year-long process analyzing the juvenile justice system and developing recommendations for change. I know I'm moving very quickly. As I said, we will pass this out and we'll come back to it. Really just want to get a high-level overview. Moving to Oregon, where they similarly have both the Criminal Justice Commission, who is focused on improving the legitimacy, efficiency, and effectiveness of state and local systems. Their commission consists, the criminal justice, of 9 members, 7 of whom are voting members appointed by the governor. The remaining 2 are non-voting members appointed by the president of the Senate and the Speaker of the House. Their Juvenile Court Advisory Committee was established in 2019 as an independent body housed in the Department of Sentencing Policy. I've got a typo there. That should be Oregon. They were awarded a grant in 2022 that provides for the creation of their advisory board. South Dakota, again, has the Juvenile Justice Oversight Council, which was created for the purpose of providing independent review of their state juvenile justice system. Their membership of 19 members is much more spelled out and prescriptive in legislation. You'll see there who appoints who and some specific members. We highlighted this because many of the other states don't have as prescriptive of a membership, and they left it to either the governor or the legislature to nominate who was to be members of that. Their Corrections Commission, as with others, is to assist the DOC in examining criminal justice issues and developing initiatives to address problems in corrections and criminal justice. State law requires them to undertake a continuing study of criminal justice issues in South Dakota, which may include a review of current felonies, felony sentences, sentencing options, practices, programs, trends, and initiatives. I included that bullet because South Dakota was one where they explicitly spelled out specific studies that they were to undertake and what issues they were to address. Now, this one also says that no funds other than those for normal operating costs may be expended from the prison industry's revolving fund for the purpose of enhancement, development, or expansion without the approval of this commission. So they have specific oversight in that area. The 9 members there serve at the pleasure of the appointing authority and may be removed by the authority at any time. They meet at least 2 times a year. They said they have subcommittees. None of them have been listed for the last 3 years, though, in their work. Looking at Texas, they get more specific in what they're supposed to assist the department in. The Texas Board of Criminal Justice exists to provide public safety, positive change in offender behavior, and to reintegrate offenders into society. There's 9 members appointed by the governor to oversee the Department of Criminal Justice, which provides confinement, supervision, rehabilitation, and reintegration. And again, that Board of Criminal Justice is actually housed within the Department of Criminal Justice. They separately have the Advisory Council on Juvenile Services, which consists of 14 statutorily defined members. They're listed there. We'll share this around. The Advisory Council has some explicit charges there in Texas, determining the needs and problems of county juvenile boards, conducting long-range strategic planning, reviewing, proposing revisions to existing or new proposed standards, analyzing the potential cost impact, assessing development recommendations, and advising the board on any other matters of interest. Last state, before I promise you I will take a breath and take your input on what you'd like us to dig into, is the state of Utah. And this one is interesting because it's a single commission with multiple divisions. And you'll see across the top, Juvenile Justice, Sentencing Commission, the Utah Substance Abuse and Mental Health Advisory Council, the Domestic and Sexual Violence, the Indigent Defense Commission, and the Utah Office of Victims in Crime all sit within one large structure, the Commission on Criminal and Juvenile Justice. So Utah is a little bit different than all of those that I just went through in that they house multiple entities under this larger Commission on Criminal and Juvenile Justice. They're housed within the commission. It was created in 1983, and it is the coordinating body for criminal and juvenile justice across the state. This one exists in the office of the governor. I'm going to take a big breath there and look to you all. As I said, we were really sharing this to give you a rapid fire sense of the diversity of ways states approach it. And looking at the 7+ that we highlighted here and the dozen more that we looked at, the vast majority did have multiple entities. This last that I shared with you, Utah was the outlier there where they had a single body, but then they crammed a lot of different commissions and subcommissions within it, and they weren't even calling them subcommittees, working groups, or task forces. It was just divisions within a commission. We've got about 5 minutes before I want to move us. I promise we will come back to this, but we'd love to just start getting your input and reactions of where you'd like us to dig deeper, either on a specific state, additional states, or functions of multiples. Rep. Weissman.
My goodness, it was not. I'm sorry. You think I know that in this room by now. Anyways, I just no specific directive there, but I would just pin that for our consideration. We are less empowered by our Constitution as a legislature than, say, the eastern states who've been around since colonial times. But we are more empowered than a lot of Western states. And I think that as we grapple with the executive legislative balance of, frankly, power, we need to keep that in mind. Thank you.
Appreciate that. And I'll put on the table, if there are states where you'd like to know what their experience has been with whether it's the structure or where it's housed, we're happy to reach out and do some interviews with folks or even see if folks may be able to speak to this group.
Barrick, this is not for next week, but maybe a holiday project. I think it would be super helpful if we could break this stuff down into a matrix showing similarities and differences in the various states and topics as defined by Representative Weissman.
Absolutely.
I think it would be great to look at states that are similar to Colorado, state supervised and county administered. In the states that were mentioned, I don't think that any of them were similar to Colorado's government structure. So, if we could look at something that's very similar to Colorado state supervised and county administered, it'd probably give us a good perspective on, what worked in that particular jurisdiction. Then we can dig a little deeper and figure out what are the trends and issues. So that would be my recommendation.
We're happy to take that up. We'll look at the structure and partisan makeup as well as to Rep. Weissman's points. Other question, I want to make sure our folks online have opportunity to give us any guidance as well. Okay, Maureen.
Yes, I think just to say to the group, as we follow this up and we get some kind of matrix, I think we need to allot, obviously it's what we're going to be talking about. This is our deliberation. As you do this further research and maybe even coordinate with Rep. Wiseman, legislative services, help with it. The more information we can get, particularly in a structured way, the better, because I think, a lot of things were very interesting in what you presented. So I appreciate that. But this is really, we're going to have to dedicate a lot more time to looking at these issues before we start what should Colorado's look like. So thank you.
Absolutely. We will take everybody's input. Rep. Weissman, I will probably take your suggestion up on OLS. I will share, we spoke with Allison and the full criminal justice team over at NCSL. And they said this is one of the few topics that they have not done a report in more than a decade, because it has been moving so quickly and evolving across the country that there is no consolidated research on the topic. So Colorado right now, is to their awareness, is one of the few that's having these conversations. But with that, I think we are just on time to move into our public comments. So I'll hand it back up to the chairs.
Thanks a lot. So now we're going to move into public testimony. We did announce at the last meeting that people who were interested in signing up to testify and to comment should, and we did coordinate, and there are some people that I won't call out loud that were helpful in coordinating a lot of the testimony for today. Most of the, I have a list of people we will call on, and I want you to know that we did provide prompts or, a guideline for questions. So to keep people more or less on track on the goal of this working group, so that we didn't talk about particular policy issues, but we are talking about structure, mission, membership, transparency, independence, how, where this group would be housed. All those issues are in the prompt questions. And probably I should pass out those prompt questions to everybody. Carrie has a hard copy, so we'll get a copy to everybody. But I think all of the testifiers have a copy of these prompt questions. And then our facilitators are going to keep track. So each person, they're going to keep track of who they are, who they represent, and then their answers to each one of these prompt questions. So when you'll have that organized for you when we move into further discussion and deliberation on what we want to recommend. So with that background, I think the first person I'm supposed to call is Terrence Carroll, if he's online. Terrence, are you there? Okay. Is he coming in? Oh, he is. Okay. So I'll.
Excuse me, can we take a 10-minute break now instead of, because this is so important, and I think we need to take a break.
We do have one scheduled in 45 minutes if you'd like to move it to now, and then we can go through all public testimony in a block.
I ain't gonna make it 45 minutes.
Okay. I don't mind having a 5-minute break. Thanks. Do you want to join us at the table? We'll wait a couple minutes.
As we're waiting for the last few folks to join, to everybody in the room and online, I'm going to apologize in advance that I may at times pause the conversation to move forward. We do have quite a few presenters. We've got a pretty tight time limit. So as they're coming up on 10 minutes, I'm going to flash them a 2-minute warning to make sure we also have some opportunity for questions.
Great. Thanks. Mr. Speaker, do you want to go ahead?
Thank you. We didn't have this fancy stuff when I was here. And I have to admit, I have some anxiety because I try to avoid coming into the Capitol at all cost. And I'm happy my friend Senator Bob Gardner's not here in purpose so that there's in person, because there's only really one simple country lawyer. And I would like to say for the record, he stole that from me when we served on the House Judiciary Committee. Thank you for having me again. I decided to come here today and just say a few words, and I really am going to try to stick to 2 to 3 minutes because I think I can say what has to be said in 2 to 3 minutes. I wanted to be here today and just say a few words. One, because I weighed in this last spring when TCJJ was up for sunset, and I had a few words to say. And I thought since I weighed in this spring, I should probably say a few words again. Primarily because in 2007, when TCJJ was created, myself, along with the late Senator Ken Gordon, were the prime sponsors of the bill in 2007, which created TCJJ. And there's some people who were here back then who were involved in it and understand the process that we went through to create the TCJJ initially. So I wanted to give some background on why we did it, and also what I think we can do to improve whatever the next iteration of this is. And I'd like to thank the governor for pulling you all together to try to start having a conversation about how can we address criminal justice issues in the state in a much more effective manner. So when we did the TCJJ in 2007, the state was still in the middle of a budget crisis, as some of you remember. We had a significant deficit, both structural and real, in the state. And one of the largest drivers of that deficit that we were facing, and for those people who are listening, to clarify, Colorado doesn't really run deficits. We just say we do, because structurally we can create a deficit. But we were struggling with the budget, and we had some budgetary constraints. And as I remember, we had to cut about $1 billion out the budget going into 2007 because of the recession that we were in. One of the things that we started looking at were what are the main drivers for our budget problems in the state of Colorado. One of the biggest drivers, and the one that we could probably address most effectively, was the criminal justice system, Department of Corrections, the amount of money we were spending on folks who were incarcerated in the state. It was absolutely astronomical, and we were creating new laws every day to put more people in jail in the state of Colorado. So myself, Senator Gordon, and then Governor Ritter had a sit down and tried to figure out what could we do to improve the situation. How could we be more thoughtful about approaching criminal justice in the state in terms of who goes to jail, who doesn't go to jail, alternatives to incarceration. What do we do with juveniles? How do we reduce recidivism? How do we reduce our jail population? There was really no easy answer to it because there were so many stakeholder groups that had so many opinions. And as the young kids would say, there were a lot of folks in their feelings about what was going on. And so we were trying to find a way to get people out their feelings and bring people to the table and have an effective conversation. TCJJ is what we came up with. And the reason that we came up with TCJJ, we thought if we could get all the actors, or at least what we thought were the actors who needed to be at the table, we could have a conversation about how do we conduct research. And this was the charge of the TCJJ back then. And I had to go back and look at the fiscal note because the fiscal note always has the best information about what we were, at least my opinion, always has the best information about what we were trying to do at that particular time. And I've aged a little bit since 2007, so my memory is not as good. I even have gray hair now, but only right here, but not up here, for the record. But, you know, Tom and Maureen, you still look the same from 2007, especially you, Maureen. So when we decided to do TCJJ, the charge was to conduct research on sentencing policies and practices, alternatives to incarceration, how do we reduce recidivism, and how do we do cost-effective crime prevention in the state of Colorado. The idea was not generally to create bills or to produce legislation. That was not necessarily the driving force behind TCJJ. It was to bring folks to the room, and it was a pretty big room at the end of the day, to talk about how do we proactively reduce the cost of criminal justice in the state of Colorado around the principles that we laid out. I suspect we probably should have done a better job creating a North Star. We probably should have done a better job of ensuring that there were community voices. And so these are things that we can fix right now, because when I decided that I would come out against keeping CCJJ going in its then form, it was because I thought there were some things we missed and that probably needed to be fixed. And I looked out over the years as I saw CCJJ grow up into adulthood. Perhaps there was a need, and there was a need for better community engagement. The experts that were engaged weren't necessarily diverse in their backgrounds and experience. There were probably too many system actors involved in terms of looking at criminal justice in the state of Colorado. And nothing against system actors, but a lot of times folks who are embedded in the system sometimes have a bias, either implicit or explicit, towards maintaining the status quo in some way. And it appeared from the outside looking in that it was becoming increasingly ineffective and a roadblock to some really creative, community-oriented ways of addressing our criminal justice system and improving it. And then sometimes it became a tool, just a very blatant and gross political tool to advance narrow legislative agendas. So how do I think we can move forward? And I'm apologizing now because I know I'm going over my own 3-minute limit, but I'm a Baptist preacher and a recovering politician and a lawyer. I'm prone to be long-winded. It's a triple threat of long-windedness, which I work really hard at trying to avoid, but apparently I fail sometimes. So what can we do? Retro is a cool thing again. And I suspect we should probably go retro, like a nice British bespoke tweed suit from Peaky Blinders, that kind of retro that doesn't quite ever go out of style. So what can we do? I suggest that in order to avoid politicization, try to return to the original roots of really looking at evidence-based decision-making. What's the best way based on what we know are the best practices? What's the best research out there in terms of how do we get from point A to B and beyond? And also try to avoid the gatekeeping capacity that CCJJ had taken on, that if a criminal justice bill didn't come through CCJJ, that should not be the deciding factor on whether it's good legislation or not. Some folks in the room were here when we used to have the substantive omnibus criminal bill every year. It went away for a reason, because it had become a bill that was a gatekeeper, and it was a one-sided gatekeeper at that. And traditionally, once it became that, it no longer had the capacity to build bipartisan, nonpartisan support when we were looking at criminal justice legislation in the General Assembly. In fact, it became a dumping ground for anybody's idea about what we should do around criminal justice in terms of new sentencing or not having new sentencing. For example, one year someone tried to amend the omnibus bill, and I think it was the last year we had it. Turns out that Colorado did not have, I think it was 2007, actually, same year we did CCJJ. Turns out Colorado did not have a law against having intercourse with farm animals. True story. Someone tried to put that into the omnibus bill. Turns out there were people opposed to that. And it kind of blew up. Who knew that there were people upset over that? But it kind of blew up. I'm dead serious, Janet. It happened. So apparently there was a lobby not to protect farm animals. I think they were from Wyoming, but it did create. I know I'm gonna start a border war, but we need to avoid. But the point is that this omnibus bill became a gatekeeping bill to its own detriment, and eventually led to it being ineffective. And hopefully whatever the follow-on to CCJJ is, that does not fall into that trap of becoming ineffective because it falls into this gatekeeping role. And then lastly, whatever's done next, there should be clearly stated up front what the shared values and what the North Star is, what the charge is for whatever the successor entity is. Not just we want to do research on this, not just that we want to do evidence-based, but what are the common values that are going to drive decision-making going forward? Is it to reduce recidivism? Is it to reduce the cost associated with the criminal justice system? Is it effective crime prevention? What's the North Star going to be going forward? And I said I was going to do lastly with that. Baptist preachers do 3 closings generally. I'm going to do 1.5, maybe 2. This is number 2 or 1.5, depending on how you count. I can't stress enough the need for community engagement, both at the grassroots level from individuals and from non-system grassroots organizations to be engaged in whatever the successor entity is that's recommended. So I will stop there and take any questions if there are any questions. And I'd like to apologize to the entire state of Wyoming, and I will see you at the stock show.
I will also just invite those of you who are joining us online to drop any questions in the chat or to raise your hand, and we'll get those questions to the speaker as well. But
I was going to invite questions also, and I want to thank Representative, former Speaker Carroll for all of these comments. Great insight, great history, and the demise of the omnibus bill was a frustrating time.
Yeah, you were there for that. Yep.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I remember that as well, because I was the one that said, if they have an omnibus bill, I want an omnibus bill. And that was not particularly well received. So then it was issue specific legislation. So again, I also appreciate, Mr. Speaker, you coming in and your thoughts. I think they're well taken. Thank you.
Do you have a comment, or, and I know it's almost impossible to figure it out, but it's why we're here. How to avoid that connotation of gatekeeping? You know, if you have a group of expertise, subject matter experts, and hopefully in this exercise, you know, in a better form than we've had ever, and that group makes a recommendation, how is it not going to be perceived as quasi gatekeeping or utilized that way? How do we avoid that?
I think it has to be explicit and conscientious in that regard, and remind the public and other folks in the General Assembly every time you come with a recommendation that it's not intended to function as the be all to end all of all things related to any particular topic, and that the recommendations coming forward are based on the considered judgment of the folks who are in the room. And make it clear, it's based on the judgment of the folks who are in the room. And there may have been stakeholders who, for whatever reasons, were not in the room, didn't know where the room was, got lost on the way to the room, or just went to a different room altogether. It doesn't mean that their concerns are not valid. And then one of the things I always used to say about gatekeeping when I was Speaker of the House, because you know, when you're Speaker, sometimes you do have to gatekeep. I mean, there's some things you just have to do it. But I also had the rule that I reserve the right to be wrong. And I think whatever the successor to TCJJ has to have that perspective that it reserves the right to be wrong. Because when you get a bunch of people in the room, the biases of the people in the room are going to show up. And then the biases of the loudest people in the room are going to show up. And always have to, you know, be super conscientious and super aware to ensure that folks are aware of their biases and that they own their own biases. And that goes back to the gatekeeping perspective, that if you're not aware that people will perceive you as a gatekeeper, it's easy to fall into that role.
What advice do you have for us to avoid the, as you say, gross political tool? How do we avoid that with our recommendations?
You know, that's a harder question to answer, because it's in a political environment and there's going to be politics involved in this, and there's no way around that. And I think everybody has to be honest with the fact that there are politics involved in this. What I'm saying in terms of being a gross use of politicization, I'm not even pronouncing words correctly this morning, but you get what I'm saying. That's what I'm more concerned about, is politicizing the issue in order to score political points. And I think that's what I'm trying to get to. And I believe that some people, and I thought this from time to time, that at times this issue of criminal justice has become politicized. I'll give you, I know some people are going to disagree with me on this, but I'll give you a good example. Fentanyl. I mean, it became a political thing. And we roll it back one year, then we roll it forward the next year based on the political climate. And if the CCJJ or whatever we call it is going to be evidence-based and it's going to reflect reality and best practices, it has to resist being pushed and shoved around by political hype and perceived political problems. It's one of the most difficult things for people who work in this process, in the political process, and who serve in office, is understanding where to draw the line between responding politically and responding with some distance from the situation. And I think to govern, to be an effective policymaker, you have to have that ability to understand the political lay of the land, but at the same time, taking a step back and really having really sober-minded thoughts about the issue that you're dealing with. Because it's so much easier, especially like an issue like fentanyl, where so many families are torn apart by it, both as victims and because someone may be a perpetrator. It's easy to get caught up in the passion of it all and make a poor decision because you're caught up in the passion. And I think in order for whatever comes next to avoid that is to try to find ways to step away from the passion in order to make a good decision. I'll give you a good example. I'll be on this, on how I did it. This kind of was my committee room back in the day before it got remodeled. And we sat over that way somewhere. And we would have some pretty emotional hearings. The Judiciary Committee always hears really emotional things. And I remember when we were doing there was a legislation to try to roll back the statute of limitations for sex assault so that you could get to actors from 20 or 30 years ago. I had some feelings about it. I understood the issue. As a lawyer, I believe in the statute of limitations because there's a reason we have them. But I also, as a survivor of childhood sex abuse, I was like, I understand the need to want to go after the person who perpetrated a crime against you. There was so much emotion in the room. I don't believe people would have taken a good vote that day. So one of the things that I would do regularly when we had emotional votes like that, or potentially emotional votes, I wouldn't vote that day, or I would vote 2 or 3 hours later to give people opportunity to clear their head and think about and process the things that they've heard in committee. I think CCJJ probably didn't, because I wasn't there every day, or never there really after I left being on it years and years ago. I don't know if there was a built-in process to allow people to step back and process the information they had. And when you get caught up in passion, which is, politics is a lot about passion, sometimes you don't make the right choice. You make the most politically expedient choice. And there has to be someone who comes in, there has to be some voice somewhere that says, hey, let's take a step back before we do this. And I'm not sure if there's a formal mechanism to do that. But that's what I'm thinking about when I said that.
And this is where I have the unfortunate task of cutting off what I know could continue for at least another hour. Mr. Speaker, thank you.
Oh, thank you, Barrett.
So much. And I hope that we can impose and reach out to you again for your wisdom and thoughts as this group starts to think about mission and structure and some of the parameters.
I'm happy to. I mean, I live like 2 blocks from the Capitol. It feels like really more like 4. So I did it by accident. I forgot the building was here. So I'm happy to help in whatever way.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And I'm sorry to cut this off.
Thank you. Thanks, Terrence. The next person is Jack Johnson. I think Jack's online. Do we know? Okay. Okay, we'll pass on Jack and go to Elise Logerman, who is here, I know. Thank you, Ms. Logerman. Go ahead, introduce yourself and give us your wisdom.
Hi, Bar. Okay. My name is Elise Logerman. I'm here today just on behalf of myself. I'm an attorney. I'm the former executive director for the Colorado Juvenile Defender Center, and I was youth policy counsel for ACLU of Colorado. So I've been working on juvenile justice reform in Colorado for about close to 10 years now. I've sat on a lot of different task forces and committees and worked on some bills at the Capitol. I know some of you from that. So I thought what I might start with today is my experience, and it's mostly in the juvenile area, around things that have worked. So when I think back over the last, I don't know, since 2016 or so, about where we've come to consensus around juvenile reform efforts and then successfully brought something forward, two big examples come to my mind. One is we did expungement reform in 2017 and 2019. And that was really born from a community nonprofit, CJDC, bringing the issue forward, and over the course of 2 years, doing really heavy collaboration with CDAC to come to consensus and agreement around expungement reform, and then pulling in the other folks who we needed to pull in, judicial, DYS, all the other juvenile stakeholders, to come to agreement on a bill. And then we were able to bring something that was unopposed that everyone could agree on forward. And it made some really significant changes in expungement law in 2017. And we all did a similar consensus bill in 2019 to clean up some things we needed to fix. So that was not an effort that came out of any state created task force or group. That was just people who were experts in that area, seeing an area that needed reform, making their own group, pulling it together. That was really pulled together by an outside community nonprofit, not by a government agency, and then coming to consensus and bringing something through. The other thing I'd say, the most major consensus juvenile reform bill that's come through in the last 5 years is probably 19108. And that was the result of work of the IO Youth Task Force. So that was a time-limited task force that ran for about a year. It pulled together experts in juvenile. Everyone, it was a large group, but everyone in the room were either nonprofit, defense, prosecution, all the different agencies, probation, but focused on juvenile. And we also brought in people from outside the delinquency system, right? Because you can't figure out reform if you don't work with the other systems like Department of Human Services that take care of kids. So we had a time-limited purpose. We had specific data we were supposed to look at. We had a task we were supposed to do, which is looking at how often and for how long we were incarcerating youth and what we could do to change that. And we came out of it with some ideas, and it went into a bill, 19108, which passed and which had a lot of reforms in it. So that was the result of something that was government created, the task force, but not something like TCJJ, a more limited task force focused on a specific issue. In terms of TCJJ, in the juvenile space at least, we just haven't seen major reforms come out of TCJJ in the juvenile space. I think some of that is a result of the fact that the main group of TCJJ didn't include the experts that you would need from all these different parts of juvenile to be able to have a robust and meaningful conversation about that. And I think someone else who's here to talk today will give you some more about that. So I don't want to take up too much time, but it is a totally different group of people that you really need around the table if you're going to delve into juvenile stuff. And I do see, I know there are people who know some things about juvenile on this committee, but I do see the same thing sort of in the way that this working group was created, at least in the executive order. There's no listed member who has to be juvenile focused. So I would hate to see that pattern continue going forward as we're thinking about these different groups that we might create. So in my experience in this space over the last however many years, if you want people with different opinions to come together and reach consensus on smart reform around justice issues, I have seen that happen when we have time-limited groups with the right people at the table, with a specific purpose in mind, or a list of specific tasks they have to do. And by right people, I mean people with both experience and expertise, including community, who can speak to the issue at hand. And based on what I have seen, a more permanent broad-based group like TCJJ just hasn't had the same ability to move forward reforms, at least in the juvenile space. And I'm talking about the juvenile context, but I think this is similar for a lot of other areas that touch criminal justice, right? The people you want at the table for competency is different than restorative justice, is different than adult diversion, and so I think having smaller time-limited task-oriented groups can be more effective in many spaces related to criminal and juvenile justice reform. Having a smaller time limited task oriented group also addresses two other problems that I saw with the CCJJ, which have sort of already been talked about a bit, so I'm not going to belabor them. But one of them is community engagement. It was just really government heavy body. And when you have a broad-based permanent body like that, it's really hard for community and also for nonprofits that work with community to be on it, because community members work, they go to school, we haven't traditionally paid them. That's of course something you guys could talk about. But also in the nonprofit space, it's hard to get grant funding to sit on a multi-year, broad-based, long-running committee. And so when I was working for a nonprofit, I could do something like the IOU's task force or the subsequent JJRC, because it's time limited with a specific focus that you can fit into your grant objectives. So that's something to think about. And then the gatekeeping function in the juvenile space, you already heard about this, but in the juvenile space as well, for multiple years, multiple issues we've heard at the Capitol when we're bringing forward something that is evidence-based reform, didn't go through the CCJJ, so you can't have it. And we just can't have a gatekeeper in that way if we want to have smart juvenile justice reform at the legislature. So my suggestion would be that we figure out how, if we're going to have groups to do this and do reform by consensus, to have these time-limited groups that are discussing something specific, with a goal to come out of that conversation actually making some meaningful change. And I know that those groups will need to have a shared purpose, because we've also had some time-limited committees that were not as effective. And that usually happens when the people coming into the room don't have a shared vision for what the committee is going to do. You know, if we're not coming in with an agreement that we have too many kids in custody and we need to investigate ways to change that, and we start talking about whether we need reform at all, then we're not going to reach consensus and come out with something. So there does need to be a shared vision or a North Star for the committee to work around. Having one permanent standing group for this broader issue just hasn't proven to be inclusive or effective in the space that I've been working. So that's not the direction that I would recommend. Happy to answer any questions.
Thank you. Sorry to be the hot bench this morning. Ms. Logeman, thank you for being here. The sufficiency of the former CCJJ in addressing specifically juvenile issues is maybe the single most persistent thing that I heard, and the earliest. In the interest of time, I'm actually not going to ask you to elaborate that today, but something that some of us have talked about with our chairs and facilitators is, I mean, I would love to see sort of written comment if you, I guess I'm inviting you to sort of expound on the relatively short amount of time that is possible today, maybe to me or all of us, in a very detailed way. What are the right and wrong ways to have the right input from whom on juvenile issues specifically, given that that is your wheelhouse? What I was going to ask you about is maybe a bit different and more focused, specifically in the juvenile space. One issue that I'm grappling with is sort of what should be the ambit or scope of whatever all we set up. It's one thing to say we want a committee, a commission, a thing to range over all of, let's say, sentencing. That's one thing. That's quite a different thing than the following. We want to set something up, and again, let's confine to juvenile for now, to look at the really big, hairy, complex issues. I hold up SB 271 as an example, the 300-page misdemeanor sentencing reform bill. That to me is kind of a classic example. If you're going to have a big multi-stakeholder group to consider tough questions, that's a paradigm case. On the other hand, a bill that makes some changes to one particular criminal statute to say that ought to be, routed through something like CCJJ or whatever in the future is a different thing. So in the juvenile space, where might you propose that we draw that line?
Thank you, Representative Weissman. You mean a line between like what we would send to a committee versus something that's issue specific that maybe a group like the expungement group would take on?
Sorry if I didn't put the question well. What is big enough for a committee, a task force, a work group to even need to bother with versus what is, and feel free to reject the whole premises of the question if you think that's best. That on the one hand. On the other hand, what frankly is a minor enough thing that a duly elected legislator of either chamber, of either party, ought to just be able to go ahead, have the input of the drafting office to get it written the right way, do the stakeholder work of the sort that you alluded to in some of those other efforts, bring that bill to the General Assembly.
I think it's really hard to draw that line. And I think the way, and I'm not to put judgment on your question, but I think framing it that way leads us into possibly a gatekeeping thought frame, right? Where it's like, well, if it's this big or if it's this sort, then it has to go through a bigger committee or a bigger whatever. And I think it's really issue specific because, you know, there are some issues that we might have, like a community coalition or a community nonprofit has been working on for 5 years, and they've been engaging folks, and we have all the folks at the table, and we've been talking about the solutions. And so then does that also now have to go through a committee because we branded a big issue and a legislator can't bring it forward? I don't think so, right? There are a lot of different ways to build coalitions in community and also maybe through like a task force that's created by the government. And I don't think one is necessarily better than the other or required for a certain level of issue. But I think a reframe of your question that might be helpful for this group to consider is, you know, if we're going to have some kind of group or committee or what, you know, wherever it's going to live, how will they decide what issues it's appropriate for them to look at, right? And so one example you could sort of look at is I never get the name of this legislative committee right, you know, the Legislative Committee for the Behavioral Health and the Criminal and Juvenile Justice Systems. But they this year, they created a juvenile like subgroup. That subgroup got together. They talked about a few different issues, and they came out of it with 2 bills that are going to come forward around 2 issues that I think are important: crisis response for youth and diversion. And so, you know, if you have a standing legislative committee that can kind of identify some of the stickier issues that maybe aren't being addressed in community already, or by a coalition already, or by a legislator already, but need to be looked at, or require consensus, like 1908. I think the reason it was a good area for consensus is we were looking at really in detail at how we should be using evaluations for our youth to establish their needs and their risks and whether they're eligible to diversion. And we needed everybody at the table to talk about that. We needed the people who actually implement those. We needed the mental health experts to tell us what's evidence-based. We couldn't do it with a smaller group of people. So there are some issues where, for whatever reason, you might need more consensus or more collaboration. And maybe if you have a standing legislative committee or something like that that can identify those issues and then create the time-limited group, maybe that's one way to go about it.
And again, this is where I unfortunately have to cut off this conversation. I would ask our witness and any others who come forward, if you're willing to share your comments in written form, we'd be happy to distribute them to the members and members of this group. If you have further questions, if you'll email them to Carrie or myself, we'll do our best to follow up with our presenters and so we can get you more information. I apologize for having to cut this off.
No, thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Ms.
Yeah, and I just want to say, yeah, if some people may not be able to finish all their thoughts, and any written testimony as well will be reviewed by us. So Stacy calling. Hello, Stacy. Please proceed.
Thank you. Thank you. My name is Stacy Calling. I'm here representing the Colorado Office of the Alternate Defense Counsel. The OADC, for those of you that don't know, is an independent state agency tasked with making sure folks who qualify for the public defender have a court-appointed attorney when the public defender has conflict of interest. I'm the OADC's youth defense coordinator, so I make sure all kids who are charged in Colorado, whether in the delinquency or the adult system, who are entitled to court-appointed defense but can't have the public defender represent them, have lawyers who specialize in youth defense and are qualified to advocate for kids in that specific space. My job was created about 10 years ago with a lot of recognition that representing kids in delinquency in adult court is a specialized practice area, requires specialized skills, knowledge, and training. So over the last 10 years, I've been a member of, or am currently a member of, I've had the privilege of being able to serve on many policy groups in Colorado. I won't name them all, but some of them that Ms. Logeman talked about and others. There's been a lot over the years, and you know, every group is full of well-meaning people who want to improve the juvenile justice system. It's overall a really good thing that so many people want to do that. As we all know, some groups are more effective than others at doing it, and there's lots of reasons for that. I'm here to ask that if you're going to put another commission similar to CCJJ in place, first, I think it's essential that there be a separate group for youth justice, a separate group of experts and community members to look at that system. The statutory purpose of Colorado's juvenile legal system is distinct from the purpose of the adult general criminal legal system. It's explicitly restorative, focused on the best interests of the kids, victims, and community, and explicitly to assist kids who go through the system in becoming productive members of society. That's just a different legislative purpose than the adult system. Also, the code itself, the legislative code is substantively and procedurally different than the adult criminal code. You can't just know adult criminal law and criminal procedure in general and understand how the juvenile system works. It's just different. And finally, kids' cases involve their families and their communities, such as schools, in a way that adult cases just do not. There's just a lot of other players that need to be there. Every agency that serves the system either does so exclusively, like child welfare, only serves kids, or has separately designated units or people for youth cases, like juvenile probation department or pretrial services specific to juvenile, child welfare, diversion specific to juvenile. And also we all have divisions of prosecutors and defense attorneys that specialize, and even judges now that specialize in just these cases. So second, I think it's essential that such a group share, as has been stated, a clear vision of its purpose, which I hope is to prevent and reduce system involvement and improve the lives of the kids who go through the system while keeping our community. I hope that that will be explicit and held high as the North Star everyone's talked about and constantly looked to as why everyone is there. And third, I hope that any such group is genuinely and intentionally inclusive of the voices of system-involved kids and families. In order to improve the lives of kids in the system, to heal those harmed by the system, and to really, truly achieve a safer community, we can't operate within the status quo of a committee of system actors sprinkled with a few voices from the community. There must be true community investment, genuine inclusion of the voices of system-impacted kids and families. This means meeting the community where it is, not inviting some members of the community to come inside our system bubble that we're comfortable in, of agendas and conference rooms and 3 minutes for providing comments and confusing lingo and all of that. System actors are really good at tweaking and sanding the edges of the system, making it more efficient and cost-effective. But we don't know what communities need, like the people living the consequences of our systems. Their voices and insights are not only helpful, it's not only just a best practice to include them, they're critical if we want to improve community safety. They don't just need a couple of extra seats pulled up for them at our government table. We need to take the table into the community and we need to all sit around it together. A group I've seen do this really well is a sort of grassroots community organization that popped up in the last few years called the Colorado Youth Justice Collaborative. It was started by community groups, not the government, and it's consistently attended by a lot of youth and system impacted families. Kids show up and they give their time, their valuable time to these meetings because they feel heard and they feel like people are there to actually listen to them. They're not being rushed through. They're not being tokenized, they're not peripheral, they're running the meetings, they're doing presentations. And I've been really impressed with how many different organizations and people they've gotten to come to the table because of that. So thank you so much for the opportunity to contribute to this conversation. I really appreciate all of your time and interest in trying to improve the system. And that's all I have. Thank you.
Thank you. Hey, thanks, Stacy. I don't see any questions. The next person is Josh Barakas, who I think is online.
I
Josh,
am. I'm here. I'm really sorry that I can't be there in person. I assume that you all can hear me. Yes? Lovely. Thank you all for taking the time and allowing me to testify. My name is Josh Barocas. I am here on behalf of myself. I'm a general internist and infectious disease physician here in Denver, though. I'm also a clinician scientist, so a researcher. And I have expertise in vulnerable populations and social determinants of health. This means that I spend my time, a lot of it, trying to answer clinical and policy relevant questions around issues around substance use, homelessness, and the criminal legal system. The creation or the recreation of a single long-standing entity that's compiled for what appears to be political purposes rather than to improve the health and safety of our community is a mistake. When the TCJJ was formed, it was meant to, and we've heard this today already, it was meant to make pertinent policy recommendations on criminal justice reform policy. The problem, though, is fairly multifactorial, and I'll touch on two things that I see as the problem that I fear might be being recreated. First, and perhaps most importantly, it lacked meaningful and authentic community engagement. And if I've learned anything from my nearly 20 years in medicine, it's that making recommendations or decisions without meaningfully engaging the people that you're trying to help only leads to further problems and more division. And I don't think that our system can tolerate any more division, specifically around criminal justice reform. And I say this having had to do this as a physician. Imagine for a moment, thank goodness I don't do colonoscopies, but imagine for a minute that your physician told you that you had to have a colonoscopy, no questions asked. There was no room for answering questions, listening to your concerns, or finding alternative options. A colonoscopy was forced upon you. That's what essentially most of CCJJ did, is it forced change on people. So without meaningfully bringing the voices of people with lived experience to the table, without meaningfully bringing the voices of those true experts, not government actors, to the table, as it appears that the governor is hoping for, there is no chance that a new committee would produce meaningful policy that benefits the community. Second, there's a basic premise that needs to be understood, and that is that criminal justice issues are individual health and public health issues. I'll cite a couple things. A recent paper in the Journal of Epidemiology demonstrated that youth who had experience with the carceral system, that both probation and incarceration had negative impacts on mental health. Just think about that. Probation itself, not just being incarcerated, but probation itself had long-term negative impacts on mental health of youth. Another study in the Journal of the American Medical Association demonstrated that people who spent time in solitary confinement were 24% more likely to die in the first year after release because of suicide and homicide, and they were 127% more likely to die of an opioid overdose in the first 2 weeks after release compared to people not in solitary confinement. The point here is that the decisions that are made in the legislature and by some committee change the trajectories of the lives of my patients and the trajectory of our public's health. As a physician and a public health professional, respectfully, I'm the one that sees the results of these types of legislation, not you. And even as an expert in the field, I am not an expert in everything that can happen, the downstream consequences following incarceration. So considering that some single entity can consider every public health, long-term public health impact of criminal legal reform is, quite frankly, not something that should be supported. Finally, the intersection of the public health effects of criminal legal policy are complex. Assuming, as I mentioned, that a single entity that's charged with creating meaningful policy over a broad swath of these issues is laughable. In no world would you go to a dermatologist for a colonoscopy or a general surgeon for psychiatric care, despite the fact that they all went to medical school. Criminal legal policy, along with homelessness, substance use, and pandemic preparedness are fundamental issues of our time, of our generation, of my generation. Like COVID, these are public health emergencies and should be treated as much, with more than a stagnant committee that doesn't understand the full breadth of the emergency. Thank you.
Thank you, Josh. Appreciate your contributions. Not seeing any questions. Thanks for coming in today and take care.
Thank you.
Jack, I missed you on the beginning. So Jack Johnson.
Good morning, members of the committee. My name is Jack Johnson. I'm an attorney at Disability Law Colorado. I also sit on that committee that was discussed earlier, and I'm the chair. It's the task force on the treatment of persons with behavioral health issues in the criminal justice system. And I'm here to testify to two things. The first is the intersectionality between the criminal justice system and individuals with disabilities and the importance of their inclusion and our inclusion in this process. And the second is about my experience and a little bit of the tale of two task forces that Disability Law Colorado has been on. To start, there is a dramatic overrepresentation for individuals with disabilities, whether it's behavioral health or physical disabilities, in our criminal justice system. And we encourage that as we continue to have conversations about criminal justice reform and what that looks like in the future, it should be a goal, if not one of the big goals, to try to decouple disability and criminalization, because those two things should not be together. When we look at that, what that means for our organization is two things. The first is that any discussions around criminalization and criminal justice reform should include members of the disability community, both those with lived experiences in the criminal justice system, but also those who live with a disability who are not in the criminal justice system. And the second is that when you look at these complex issues, it is important to take into consideration each individual issue rather than look at this from a systems level. That leads me into my second related point around my service as the chair of the task force on the treatment of persons with behavioral health issues in the criminal justice system. In contrast to another committee that I've worked with and worked on in disability law has been a part of, which is the Jail Standards Commission. The Jail Standards Commission was formed with a very specific purpose in mind: to promulgate jail standards for the state of Colorado. They were given a very specific time window of 18 months to get the job done, and they had a robust set of stakeholders at the table to do that. That has been, as the legislators on this task force will see, an incredible success, where the standards have been adopted unanimously by the commission and over the next legislative session will be enforced by a bill through the General Assembly. When you contrast that with the work of other committees and other broad committees, the committee that I chair has sometimes struggled to find focus and direction. And it is because it was tasked with the treatments of people with behavioral health issues in the criminal justice system. What does that mean? And that is the question that they spent the first year trying to answer, because there are so many different things that impact the treatment of persons with behavioral health issues in the criminal justice system. As a prior witness testified to, that includes youth issues. It includes issues of people already in the system. It includes issues of diversion. It includes issues of competency. It includes issues of NGRI. And so when the committee was tasked with this broad goal, it really struggled to find specific answers to specific questions because it first had to come up with those specific questions. So we, as an organization, and as community activists strongly recommend that rather than having a blanket conversation about the criminal justice system, it is much more productive to look at the jail standards model and have specific, time-limited, focused conversations about the most pressing issues that the state has. This does not have all benefits. There are things that it does hurt, which is when you silo people and you silo issues, sometimes you run into this fact where people that are talking about the juvenile justice system and people that are talking about the criminal justice system have related issues that need to be solved together, but they can't. However, what I would say to that is that that is more about what you do to stakehold and less about what you task a commission to do. And what I mean by that is that our organization has to sit on a lot of task force around criminal justice issues, around housing, around education, and it's a lot of work. But if we were to combine and create a disability task force, it would be impossible to get anything done. And so when you create issue-specific task force, you are asking the public, you are asking the stakeholders, and you are signing yourself up for a lot of work. But as a result, you can get intersectional issues by creating a task force on, for example, a certain juvenile justice issue and inviting all of the stakeholders to that table. And that means that on Monday, they may have to go to the juvenile justice task force. And on Tuesday, they may have to go to the company task force. And on Wednesday, they may have to go to an NGRI task force. And it may all be the same people, but they're talking about specific issues. And we see that as a more appropriate alternative to creating a broad task force without direction. I'm happy to answer questions about the disability lens or about our experiences on our task force, or to go sit down.
Jack, I want to ask you a little bit of questions about the legislative group with the long name. Okay, since my relationship with that group has spanned a number of years. And my experience with it has been same, with a lack of focus and somewhat a lack of structure in terms of how it operates, and not that much staff to support it. And as you know, my office has been involved and has spent a significant amount of time working with the group. And it's been, it's been going on for 15 years, and I'm not sure how people are aware of it publicly. And how would you, thinking about that, how would you help any new group, say they wanted an oversight, something on behavioral health? How would you structure that or make it better if, we're looking at that?
Yeah, thank you for that question. That has been my task as the newly appointed chair, because not to completely discard the work that's done in that task force, there have been some tremendous bills that have moved forward from that task force. But as a whole, you're right, the task force has struggled with structure and direction, and it's because it's this living body, and we have a wonderful list of stakeholders, not all of whom, maybe not even half of whom, are consistently engaged to the full capacity to make systems change. So that's the first thing, which is you have to get the correct people in the room and get buy-in from them that they need to be there. And oftentimes that goes back to the specificity of why they're there. If you pull together a group of people and say, let's talk about the criminal justice system, and one week it's about juvenile justice, that might not be my issue, so I'm not going to show up that week, or I'm not going to engage as much that week. But if you pull together an issue and say we have 18 months to talk about reforming NGRI in the state of Colorado, every stakeholder knows two things. One, it's a very specific issue, and so I can contribute every week or every month or every quarter. And two, there is a time window. I know that if I don't show up, then in 18 months, there's going to be something and I might not like it. And so I have incentive to engage from an organizational capacity, because at the end of the day, I know that there is going to be something that impacts the clients that we care about. The second thing is around structure. And what we have basically done is taken one task force and broken it up into four. And each of these four is issue focused, but it also has a little bit more structure in terms of leadership and organization. And so we have done, I think, a good job of putting together a solution to this difficult problem of having a big task force with a big set of issues and not having direction. I would say that if we could go back and do it again, that we create these subsets as their own task force, so that that's the issue that we run into is with staffing, right? Because if these are their own discrete task forces, we can ask the legislature to appropriately fund and staff them to the level that's necessary. Whereas if it's one big task force, it becomes a mess to try to, one year there's this subcommittee, another year there's this subcommittee. To try to go back to the legislature and get the appropriate funding to staff and manage those becomes a nightmare, and oftentimes it doesn't get done.
I'll ask, and first, that one's come a long ways from its original iteration when I was an attorney general member. So good work.
Not me, probably Maureen.
But in terms of the discussion we're having on, item-specific individual task forces, I can see a lot of merit there. But do you see a value perhaps in having an umbrella also in terms of what Representative Weissman alluded to as I think you said super committee or something like that, in terms of defining, just because it has a name doesn't mean it has the power as much as bringing together resources and delegating them out. Do you see any value potentially in that?
I think, thank you for the question. I think there is some value there. I think if you do that, you have to be very specific around time parameters, because that's kind of what jail standards is. I mean, jail standards is already pretty specific, but they broke up their subgroups. But it wasn't like, subgroup A talking about food and that had unlimited time. It was subgroup A, you have 6 months, and then you have to come back together. And that jail standards as a whole has 18 months. So I think where you run into problems is if it's too broad and you don't time restrict it, you get into these endless iterations of trying to figure out what questions to even begin to tackle. And then you're in this endless loop of generating issues. There's lots of issues in this world, but no solutions. And so the time limitation, I think, would be one of the answers. And there is, I think, a little bit of value of having one broad oversight, although then you also have to make sure that you appropriately fund those subcommittees with the necessary staff and time and structure. I would say one of the models that I'm not sure how it's worked out, but is there is a task force on the treatment of persons with disabilities that the governor has started. And in the legislation, there were specific issue areas that they were asked to focus on, but each subcommittee, there's like a timeline for electing a chair to these subcommittees. So it gets really granular into the details of, how the subcommittees are supposed to operate and how they report and how voting is, right? The treatment of persons with behavioral health, like no one really has an idea of exactly what the voting threshold is to move issues forward from the subcommittee to the whole committee. So you have to get really prescriptive, I think, in order to make that be successful.
Okay,
Mr. Weissman, I think we can sneak in one
one more.
quick question and answer, and then we're going to have to move on.
Sure. Thank you, Barrick, for keeping us on track. Thank you, Mr. Johnson, for sharing. You're really getting my wheels turning. I think it's more that I wanted to just share a bit of context, maybe analogy for the committee. I've actually thought about, I used to think of it as MHD-CJS. Now I think it's BHD-CJS. I think that's an interesting model because it has a legislative oversight committee. Okay, my colors are up the poll. I'm an Article 5 person. And then there's an expert task force. I've thought since the spring, as conversations really caught fire on this subject, we might look to that, but you're calling out something new to me, which is there maybe have been some challenges there because behavioral health disorders in the criminal justice system is actually quite large. And you're urging us to scope it down further. I wanted to mention for the committee another thing I've had recent experience with, which was the interim committee on tax policy. 6 members, supportive task force of people with deep expertise in tax from the public and private sectors. Now, all of tax is impossibly broad. So the statute charges the committee not later than its second meeting in the interim to scope itself by letter. For example, we picked housing and how tax policy can incent housing. Now that's still pretty broad, but at least it chops it down a lot. So as we sort of look for models, maybe, I appreciate what you're saying about models that you've personally been familiar with. I just wanted to toss that other one out because there is some recent legislative history with it. Thank you.
And I would just briefly add, and then I'll go sit down, that BHTCJS does have the letter model and it does scope in letter. I think in certain years, those letters are more helpful than others. So that's just a word of caution. Like I will be here tomorrow to ask the committee to task us with a little bit more specific letter for the upcoming year. So I think if there is that model, that the letter needs to be a rather prescriptive, so to make sure that and really the letter should stand out the problems so that the task force can focus on solutions, I think is what we have found most successful in that committee's perspective.
Thank you, Mr. Johnson. And as I will keep saying, if you're willing to share written testimony, we would welcome the opportunity to share it with all of the members in addition to sharing the video of today.
Cassandra Harris. Good morning. State your name and proceed with your testimony. Thanks.
This is Cassandra Harris. I currently serve as the Director of Services for Project Elevate, which is one of the newer community corrections facilities in Denver. So this is a partnership between the City and County of Denver and the Empowerment Program, which is a nonprofit that's been in Denver since 1985. So I represent the Empowerment Program. But everyone said what I was going to say, so I think where I'm leaning towards is the human connection, right? That's what's I'm recognizing is missing as a society. And so in my work as the director, I have really leaned on the restorative justice practices that I've learned through the Restorative Justice Circles project. And we are finding outcomes are changing in the community corrections world for us because we're looking at the whole person and not just the criminal behavior, right? And so if I could offer anything, I mean, this is not the criminal justice system anymore. I think it's a mental health system because that's what we're dealing with, okay? We have 87 to 92% of the folks have a TBI, traumatic brain injury. And if we ignore that, then yes, they all look like criminals, right? But in reality, there's underlying issues that are going undiagnosed, underserved, whatever the case is. So I think in this space, it would be very important for everyone to recognize that, as someone said, the folks going through this are the experts. And as someone who served for many years on different issues for foster care reform, I am a foster youth. I've been institutionalized since I was 6 years old. I think there's great value in separating the juvenile justice system committee and the adult one, but also I was in the adult system, right? And what I can say is that I think that we really need to, whatever you can do to push the desire to look at mental health within the criminal justice system would be first and foremost. I mean, we're triaging right now, okay? And it's very difficult to plan for the future when you're in the amygdala, okay? And that's where we are in this environment. We are just trying to survive the day with what we got going on as a community. So I would find it to be very important to prioritize mental health services within the criminal justice system. As far someone mentioned community repair, yes, I have tried to get my folks down here. I've served 58. We have the capacity for 58 women in our facility, and I've tried to bring them down here. They are not having it. Okay, there's definitely a gap, right, and a power distance, a perception of a power distance, right. So even if you don't feel like you have all the power, and the folks out there believe. And they are very scared to approach anyone, and they actually have the answers to many of the questions that are being asked. But we need to somehow bridge that gap and bring everyone, those of you who have dedicated your time to representing these folks, bring everyone together and humanize this, right? Because we're dealing with humans at the end of the day. Yes, this is a great system, but this is a human experience for each and every one of them. And that's very important that stays at the forefront of everyone's minds, is that we're dealing with humans, and there's no cocktail for what might work for one is not going to work for the other, right? And so we just got to get creative in this space. And that's where restorative justice has been an amazing tool that we've used. You know, we had folks who in a traditional community correction setting would have been returned. But because we have this knowledge of restorative justice and we believe in connection, consent, and community, we were able to get creative, right? And so they hadn't done anything that we had to return them for. But if we weren't in that creative mindset, we would have just said, okay, we're done, right? And then I started looking at these participants. I'm like, hey guys, I think she has a TBI. I mean, she went months and was getting every type of violation. When we realized that it was a TBI, she has her life's trajectory has completely changed. Okay, she's on her way out onto non-res. She's highly successful now. But without that little piece of information, if we got stuck in that mindset where we're the authority and you're not listening to us, yeah, she would have been in prison and it would have done her no good. And so things like that. We had another participant who was vitamin deficient and was presenting with some psychosis. And if we didn't get creative in that space again and think like she's not just trying to be a criminal in this space, right? Something's going on. We got her to the doctor. They got her vitamin minerals back to homeostasis, and we were able to move on. And now she's heading out into the community, into her own place. So very important to look at the whole person and not just this one little aspect of what somebody might have done. And that's coming from someone with lived experience. If you looked at me 10 years ago, you wouldn't listen to anything I had to say because I was just a case, right? But as folks gave me the space to advocate appropriately, you know, now I'm able to do that for others. So very important to make sure that they're at people with lived experience are at every level of the decision making, right? Because we tend to use them and sometimes even exploit them at certain levels, and then it gets cut off somewhere, right? And that's where that gap happens. So we got to make sure that they're at every level. And just allow yourself to be challenged. You know, if what we were doing as a society was working, we wouldn't be sitting here trying to figure something out. So we got to be willing to be challenged in that space, no matter what level of decision making we're in.
Can I ask you just for folks who may not know, how challenging is it, and where do you go for your resources to do what you do?
Oh, it's very challenging. And mental health, we know, is, you know, it's an issue for society as a whole, but within the criminal justice world, it's very difficult. And again, there's that tendency as a system to say they're just not acting right, send them to jail. And we just want to get creative. And here I am, just a person with over 20 years of experience being institutionalized, but no formal education. I'm working on my bachelor's. But I can say from what I'm seeing, we're in trouble, for lack of better words. Okay, we really need to invest. And everyone knows, I'm sure all of you know, that an investment takes much longer than that fast, right? And that's what we're looking for. We're talking about generations of folks that have gone through this system now. We have mothers and daughters sitting next to each other, right? And to break those generational curses for folks, it's not going to be 6 to 9 months. I can tell you that. So we gotta make an investment. We gotta add additional funding. I know nobody wants to hear, but that's just what we need to do, and we're seeing it. We're seeing the benefits of that in the space that I work in.
So here's my question. As we talk about engaging community, it is really hard for people that have night jobs, 9-to-5 jobs, to come to meetings and be part, you know, to say, I'm going to come every month or whatever. And, you know, do you have some ideas on how we might design it or approach the engagement of community in a better way than is being done now, which is sometimes, you know, we'll pick one person here and one person there, and they check all the boxes, you know, it's a, you know, Black, formerly incarcerated person in reentry, and boom, we got that. I mean, and it's got to be, so if you have any ideas, it would be really helpful.
Someone said it, getting outside of your bubble. I have a conference room you're more than welcome to use if you'd like to come and meet with some folks. We can get 16 people in there. Okay, we can have all y'all, we have 58 participants, and you can come and meet with folks who are currently going through this system. There's plenty of community partners that have space where you can go out to them, and they have access to hundreds, even thousands of folks who would have invaluable information to provide you all. But right now, not too many people. I mean, I brought someone and her boyfriend, and they were in here for 10 minutes, and the anxiety was so bad they had to leave. And I remember, I think one of the biggest things was my judge when I was a child. Every 6 months I had to go in his chambers with him, and that humanized him for me. And then I, as someone who didn't have the traditional parent setting, right, that became somebody I wanted to make proud, somebody I wanted to show that I was worth something in this community, right? And he started to tell me, I'm proud of you. And you're not going to, I've never heard that when I go in front of the judge, when I was in trouble. But to hear that coming from him, sometimes that's the first time somebody's heard that somebody's proud of them, right? And it's a big deal when it's coming from somebody with where they believe there's a perception of power there, right? It's like, wow, this really important person believes in little old me, and it just changes the morale.
Well, you are somebody great in this community, first of all. And second of all, the hypothesis is that if individuals spend time in the juvenile justice system, there's a great chance that they will end up in the adult system.
Correct.
And what you've mentioned is that everybody says community, but what you've done is you spoke about a specific individual that I don't know that we've had the privilege of outlining. This individual that happens to be like the intermediary between the youth system and the adult system. So from a professional perspective, and then from a community perspective, if you were to say this person's voice is the voice that you all need to hear as you move forward, who would that individual be? Do you understand what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Okay.
Again, there's so many different ways in which folks enter the carceral system, right? I don't know. I would say for someone, you should have each and every individual, right? Someone who's gone through the juvenile justice system, someone who's transitioned over into the adult system from the juvenile justice system. There was a study done years ago that folks incarcerated, and it said about 70% of those folks had lived experience in the foster care system. Why aren't they being represented, right? If this is the majority of folks in the jails and prisons, like what? That's a missed population. And they're underrepresented, but they're overrepresented in the system, right? So having someone from every level, our resident council is made up of folks from level 1 to level 4, which are all 4 levels of our residential program. And it's very valuable. Each level's experiencing this system in a different way. And so we have all of them come, and someone on level 1 might be struggling to get to level 2 because of their behavior. This gives them an opportunity and a space to come as an advocate and not as a problem in that space, right? And then their behavior starts to change because, right, people want value. At the end of the day, everyone wants to be valued in some way, right? And we just got to give that space for everyone.
Ms. Harris, thank you very much. I really admire your courage and your willingness to share your story, and also appreciate your leadership in this space. I just wanted to circle back to something you said about the people who are in the empowerment system now having answers to many of the questions that we're asking, but they're just not able to bridge the gap and come here. It sounded like maybe they're willing to engage with this group and others if we were to come to them and meet them where they are. I just want to verify that that's accurate.
Yes, that is accurate.
Thank you.
And I am offering my space. Any other questions?
I don't see any. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Betsy Kraft. Good morning, Ms. Kraft. Do you want to state your name and proceed?
Good morning. My name is Betsy Kraft. Dear members of the Working Group on Transforming Criminal and Juvenile Justice, I am speaking today on behalf of the Colorado Drug Policy Coalition, a grassroots organization that is committed to elevating the voices of people with living and lived experience as valued community leaders, spearheading criminal, legal, and drug policy reform. A little bit about me. I am trained and certified as a Colorado peer and family specialist and have been providing peer support in the Denver jails and in the community to individuals navigating Denver's court system while working for the Office of the Municipal Public Defender for the past 2 years. Previous to this, I worked on the front lines during the pandemic with unhoused individuals, and currently I partner with academic researchers and actively recruit and engage vulnerable community members for community engaged research around issues that surround mass incarceration, substance use, and overdose. I leverage my subject matter expertise on a few different local and statewide advisory boards via the grant review process locally and at the state level for opioid abatement funding, Caring for Denver, CDPHE, and BHA. I also have my Bachelor of Science in Business and a focus in organizational leadership, but most importantly, I am an overdose survivor and somebody who has been directly impacted by the criminal legal system for the past 2 decades. As a tax-paying citizen and as a lived experience professional who engages in criminal legal reform work, I want to live in a state that values community voice in the legislative process and is willing to center and prioritize equity, diversity, and inclusion values when operationalizing criminal legal reform. You owe it to your constituents to learn from and not repeat the fundamental shortcomings and inefficiencies of the CCJJ, some of which are as follows. First, CCJJ lacked diverse subject matter experts, including folks with lived experience. Secondly, CCJJ was dominated by system actors, all government folks working on the criminal legal system or working in the criminal legal system. And lastly, CCJJ lacked meaningful community engagement. For the sake of time, and because my expertise is community engagement, the rest of my testimony will be focusing on what real community engagement looks like in the context of criminal legal reform. We cannot expect criminal legal policies that are crafted from the lens of a privileged few who do not represent the public or those who are harmed by the carceral system to meet the needs of the people these policies are intended to serve. Nor will policies crafted from this lens provide the systems level change that is needed to reform the criminal legal system. The first step to meaningful community engagement rooted in equity, diversion, and inclusion values is acknowledging that the CCJJ was inaccessible to community members in the following ways. First of which is meeting logistics. The meetings were held during work hours, which we've already kind of talked about. They're inaccessible for working people. We must offer participation options in the evening and after regular business hours. And on that note, this very meeting is inaccessible for working people. And I just ask that we be more thoughtful about this moving forward. Moving forward, all task force meetings 100% need to be ADA accessible, including for people who use mobility aids, as well as the deaf and blind people, and offer complete virtual observation and participation options. Transition services need to be available for all task force meetings and translate documents, and at the very least, translated into Spanish, since after all, 25% of Colorado's population is Spanish speaking. We must maintain a publicly available ADA accessible website reflecting all information and documents needed by the public to stay abreast of the work and opportunities for public input. Accessibility also looks like intentionally conducting outreach via employing people with lived expertise to recruit and engage using a racial and gender equity lens with an eye toward youth and adult community voices, those who have been directly impacted by the criminal legal system, to participate. On this note, I think the very fact that I, as a lived experience voice who is heavily involved in criminal legal reform work, did not even know about the CCJJ until after it sunsetted, points a lot to how inaccessible this commission truly was. Short-term time-limited task force on specific issues with specific stakeholders is needed. And authentic community engagement also means building trust with these communities by co-creating alongside lived experience professionals specific stakeholder listening sessions for adults and youth who have been impacted by various aspects of the criminal legal system. So you can hone in on specific issues and listen to the needs of the people these policies are intended to support and gather recommendations. Recognizing these stakeholder sessions will look different when looking at, per se, safely reducing jail populations or competency court, or perhaps jail-based programming and transition services for folks leaving incarceration versus youth services. Additionally, communities need transparency for how our contributions will be incorporated in the reform process and evidence of how our voices will be represented in task force operations. Authentic community engagement means inviting experienced voices and giving us prominent seats at the table with equal voting rights as the rest of the task force, and centering our voices in every step of the decision-making process. It also looks like providing training, mentorship, and resources on how the legislative process works so lived experience voices feel comfortable and confident coming to the table. And also looks like meeting people where they're at, like has already been discussed. Lastly, and most importantly, authentic community engagement means equitably compensating lived experience voices for all work and reimbursement for participation-related costs, such as travel, mileage, childcare. It does not mean giving us a $25 gift card and calling it good. We need to be fairly compensated for all work. Preferable forms of payment are cash, check, ACH payment. Authentic community engagement does not mean focusing on one or two lived experience voices, propping us up to check the LE box, so to speak, but centering our voices and giving us voting rights. To conclude, I will provide a brief example of how tokenization undermines authentic, meaningful engagement. When the Attorney General set up 19 regional councils across the state of Colorado to decide the allocation of $780 million for opioid abatement settlement funds from the hundreds of thousands of people who have died from preventable overdose deaths. As an overdose survivor, do you know how difficult it is that people with lived experience, the actual survivors of the overdose epidemic, and our family members and service providers of these individuals are granted access to share critical knowledge? But according to the MOU, only government officials are allowed voting power. And lived experience voices are deemed non-voting members, nor are we compensated for our expertise. This is the definition of tokenization. Generations of policies and practices such as mass criminalization have excluded vulnerable people from decision-making, resulting in government systems that don't meet the needs of people they purport to serve. This is not only a moral concern, but also a social, cultural, and economic liability. When entire populations are unable to fully participate in society, the enormous loss of potential affects our entire state and country as a whole. Thank you for allowing me to speak today.
Thank you so much, Ms. Robb.
Thank you for sharing.
Yeah. Are there any questions? You know, I'm not going to ask this as a question, but I may want to follow up because I think awareness of commissions is, one of the issues you raised is really important. Years ago when I was doing record sealing clinics, we put notices of them in every sheriff's office and courthouse and community centers and things like that, so people would be aware, and then ended up getting hundreds of people. But it was great as we tried to say, where are people, and making sure they share information. I would love to be able to have a conversation with you about how do we let communities know, like what are the best avenues for communication with communities? Are they through the courthouse? Are they in the in the community centers? Are they in the King Supers? We would, or whatever that where people shop. And so I may contact you further for that kind of information. Thanks.
I see Mr. Weissman's hand is up, and Maureen, I just want to mention that, we're working with 7 different commissions right now, and 5 of those have all put forward the idea of having a committee specifically around public awareness and stakeholder engagement to exactly your point.
Thank you. No question, but just appreciate your coming and being here. And it is in the middle of the day, and that is when most people work and earn and pay their bills. And also just thank you for sharing some really personally tough stuff. It does matter that those things are said on microphones like the ones in front of us all.
Thank you.
Okay, next on the list, I have Andy McNulty. Andy's online. Thank you.
Yes. Hi. My name is Andy McNulty, and I'm here representing the Lawyers Civil Rights Committee. For those of you who don't know, LCRC is a group of civil rights attorneys and advocates who represent people who are directly affected by the criminal justice system. Specifically, myself and my colleagues represent those who have had their rights violated by officials in the criminal justice system or by the system itself. We seek to remedy the issues plaguing the criminal justice system through litigation and advocacy. While I do not have previous experience with the TCJJ, myself and my organization have experience with the criminal justice reform actions in this state. Over the past few years, we have been intimately involved in helping to pass laws that would rein in police misconduct and lobbied against bills that would put more people into contact with the criminal justice system. Our knowledge of the abuses that can and often do stem from any individual's mere interaction with the criminal justice system provides the foundation for LCRC's approach to criminal justice reform and informs our positions on the TCJJ. In line with that, myself and my organization believe that the creation of a statewide entity to address criminal justice reform is unnecessary. There is already a statewide entity that is directly addressing criminal justice reform, and that entity is the Colorado legislature. And the Colorado legislature, per our state's constitution, is directly accountable to the people of our state through elections, placing another barrier between the people of Colorado and particularly underrepresented communities that have already had difficulty having their voices heard in the criminal justice reform process would be problematic. That being said, if a commission is formed, its guiding principle should be reducing contact between the citizenry and the criminal justice system. The research bears out, and my group's anecdotal evidence shows that reducing contact between the criminal justice system and the community, and particularly contact between the criminal justice system and vulnerable communities like communities of color, LGBTQ+ communities, and houseless communities, reduces the likelihood of police brutality, unlawful arrests, malicious prosecutions, discrimination, and other unconstitutional and traumatic instances that are inflicted on people. Myself and my organization would also like any commission that is formed to be comprised mainly of community members and organizations representing the community, particularly underrepresented communities. It is important that any commission be directly accountable to the communities most impacted by the criminal justice system. In service of that, there should not be a single statewide commission. Having a single statewide commission that meets at a building near the Capitol would shut out some of the most important voices. I want to provide an anecdote from my personal experience as an example. In my practice, I represent a lot of folks from underrepresented communities who have been subjected to harms from the criminal justice system through the violation of their constitutional rights. Often it's easier and more comfortable, honestly, for me to stay in my office and have my clients come for me. I know, however, that this is not the best way to reach the communities I'm serving. This is especially true of houseless individuals who have difficulty making long journeys to a lawyer's office and who might be intimidated by the prospect of doing that. So when I take on cases aimed at reforming how the criminal justice system treats houseless individuals, I bring my meetings to them. I've held meetings with clients in public parks, on the sides of streets, and under viaducts. As a part of a massive class action lawsuit, I achieved the injunctive relief that force the city of Denver to hold meetings with houseless individuals within the community at public libraries and public recreation centers throughout the city of Denver. The attendance at those meetings has been much higher than previous attendance at city council meetings, where houseless individuals would have to travel down to the city and county building rather than just meeting people where they are in the community. This is the approach the commission needs to take if it truly wants to actually receive input from affected communities. Ultimately, criminal justice reform should not be gatekept by a commission that meets once a month in an obscure government building somewhere in downtown Denver. In sum, on behalf of my organization, I am asking that a commission not be formed, that the people's elected representatives be allowed to take on criminal justice reform without input from an unelected commission that could interfere with that work. However, if a commission is created, we would ask that it is directly accountable to impacted communities, and in order to do this, it needs to be embedded in those communities and not operating as a statewide community. I appreciate the time to speak today and hope that my testimony was helpful to this process as it moves forward, and would welcome any questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Any questions?
Thanks. Jennifer Dillon? You've been waiting a long time. Sorry. Ms. Dillon, state your name and go forward, please.
Sounds great. Was my button on? Oh, okay. Yep. Okay, great. Hi, my name is Jennifer Dillon. I'm a policy coordinator for Bring Our Neighbors Home, an organization dedicated to ending mass incarceration, the criminalization of poverty, and police violence. We engage in our work through coalition building, community education, and policy advocacy at both the state and local level. We identify opportunities and organize campaigns and train and mobilize grassroots community members in the most effective way possible to pressure decision makers for change to excessively harsh or poorly designed criminal legal policies that stand in the way of a just, equal, humane, and truly safe society. So whether you agree with the reasons, I think we can all agree that the TCJJ was sunsetted last year via a democratic process for reasons. And I do worry that this working group has been formed to create a new TCJJ as a bulwark against meaningful data-driven reform, rather than what I think the TCJJ was originally intended to be, an instrument to assess forward-thinking, evidence-based ways to reshape Colorado's criminal legal system, to decrease reliance on arrest, incarceration, and punishment, and invest in proven crime prevention strategies in a setting outside of politics. From my perspective as a frequent flyer at hearings on criminal legal reform legislation here at the Capitol, and someone who follows criminal legal reform bills closely through their legislative life cycles, I noted that the TCJJ's recommendations were prioritized inconsistently. The same legislators or lobbyists who would say in regards to one bill, you know, we can't possibly do X reform because it didn't come out of the TCJJ, would then like turn around in the same session and argue on another bill that the TCJJ wasn't a useful or practical way to orient around criminal legal reform in that instance. For my observation, the TCJJ seemed in recent years to be politically leveraged in service of keeping a carceral status quo in place, or indeed in the case of like the motor vehicle theft legislation, of implementing increased carcerality. And it seems much of the successful legislation that came out of the TCJJ came in early years when there was a lot of low-hanging fruit to tackle, but in recent years, the committee was very slow to move and absent on many important and timely conversations where the community was calling for change. The data was quite clear and had been for some time. One of the most common criticisms levied toward the TCJJ during the debate over whether to sunset it was that the makeup was overly reliant on institutional actors, too many of whom were hostile or overly conservative regarding criminal legal reform, despite our current system's poor outcomes. And part of that may be a function of the fact that the CCJJ was formed 16 years ago, and the understanding of who is an expert and what kind of voices have traditionally been left out of the conversation to our detriment has radically changed in the interim. We understand today much more than we did in 2007, how vital it is to have community be meaningfully included in the development and implementation of solutions and policy decisions that directly impact them. And this is especially true when we're talking about inequitable systems. Despite the many reforms that have been undertaken since 2007, the criminal legal system remains profoundly inequitable along racial and class lines. Increasingly direct community participation involving community at all levels, from determining what gets studied through the assessment and study phase, all the way through the recommendations that are issued. There's a recognition that that's essential to decreasing the disproportionate harm caused to low-income communities and communities of color. Another growing recognition, as Betsy Kraft, so well stated, is like the fundamental role that people with lived experience need to play in reforms to the criminal legal system. Formalizing the involvement of people with direct experience will directly lead us towards powerful solutions. People with lived experience, people who have been stopped and searched, spent time in jail or prison, been a person with substance use getting treatment in jail, or been the victim of a crime, have incredibly important, unique insights into what works and what doesn't in the criminal justice system, and including those people as key influencers and decision makers is incredibly important to realizing effective criminal legal reform. Unfortunately, they're often tokenized. So if you're lucky, you'll have one person on a committee with lived experience, but this is an incredibly diverse community with so much important knowledge, and it's impossible for one person to stand in for the whole. So I've passed out this little informational guide. It's a matrix of the spectrum of community involvement that was developed by Rosa Gonzalez of Facilitating Power in accordance with the guidelines set forth by the International Association for Public Participation. Organizations like ours that work at the grassroots level, fighting to give community a seat at the table, we see this guide quite a lot, especially in the last couple years. It represents a gold standard roadmap for organizational development that results in meaningful community involvement. And it's precisely the kind of tool this working group should consider as they determine the design of a replacement for the CCJJ. For that reason, I will email the full 14-page workbook that includes this guide to this working group after the hearing, if you're interested. So the level of community involvement built into the CCJJ tended to range between level 1 and level 2. So somewhere between ignore and inform, sometimes branching out into level 3, consult. Consult is still quite a low level of community engagement. It's considered to be the basic minimum opportunity for public input into a decision. It's essentially what happens during a legislative hearing. It involves obtaining feedback about plans or ideas, but with little interaction. The promise is to listen and acknowledge issues raised, but not necessarily to act on them. The result can be tokenization, which is outlined here on this page. And as someone who works to facilitate community involvement in legislative hearings, I can tell you that it often feels performative to community and discourages long-term involvement from people who care deeply and have a lot of knowledge to share. So when you talk about struggling to have volunteers attend these meetings, part of it is just the way it's designed to not feel great. And for community involvement to be meaningful enough to impact equitable outcomes, we want the community involvement built into the entity or entities that this body recommends to be at the level 4, involve, and level 5, collaborate as much as possible. And it's important to recognize they are steps. So if you're at level 5, collaborate, you still have to inform, consult, and involve. From our perspective at Bring Our Neighbors Home, in our role as community educators and community facilitators into these kinds of conversations, we'd like to see a movement away from a single entity towards multiple entities where specific topics can be taken up in shorter, discrete time periods. But different from the task force structure of the CCJJ in that the decision-making authority lives at that lower level, perhaps under an umbrella that's purely administrative. The group of assessors and decision makers you'd want at the table to look at an issue such as raising the floor for juvenile detention are not the same as for an issue like penalties for auto theft. And issue-specific working groups meeting for discrete amounts of time instead. For the next 4 months, we're going to conduct meetings to look at why, and we're going to have the right people at the table who understand why, and we're going to call in the community who's interested in why. This structure would make it so much more easier for community, because those people who are interested in raising the floor for juvenile detention will turn out to those meetings if they're held at appropriate times, if they're held in the appropriate places for the appropriate length of time. And they're not the same people who'll be willing to sit through hours of meetings about auto theft penalties. And that's not how you get good community involvement. We'd also like to see built into the entity, or we hope to see entities, that this body ultimately recommends a significant investment in the capacity for the public to participate, as well as breaking down systemic barriers to community participation. It's not enough to meet the minimums of open meeting laws. Are meetings held at time of day that are convenient, scheduled in rural communities? Is childcare provided? I've loved all the testimony I've heard here today asking for meetings that go out into the community to meet people where they're at. That's so powerful because it's structurally problematic to get people here. And it lends itself to a certain kind of participant and a bias that I'm not sure you're aware of. We'd like to see a clear and indeed ambitious public participation goals be built into the design of these entities and formal assessments of the community involvement in relation to those goals built into the process, so that if we're off track, if we're not getting the kind of community engagement and involvement we want to get, that we can course correct before years go by. I did want to note, as just a process critique, that this meeting and the opportunity to make public comment here wasn't well publicized. We keep a pretty close ear to the ground looking for opportunities like this to weigh in on, and we had to find out about this in a very roundabout way through coalition partnerships that we've developed over the years. After hearing people say this morning that this meeting and the opportunity to give public comment here had been duly posted in accordance with the law, I looked all over the internet trying to find what I'd missed. Somewhere on the Colorado Gov website, there's an agenda for this meeting. And if you click into it, that PDF, you'll find a note about public comment being scheduled, and you'll find the find out more link on that agenda is broken. That's really not good enough. I invite you at the next break to go looking for this meeting online and see that, and act as if you were an interested community member trying to engage and see if you're able to do so. I think you'll find that you're not able to. I think I can safely say that no one here today is here today because they found out about this meeting organically as an interested party. The community was not invited in, and this is concerning, as it suggests, right or wrong, a lack of commitment to transparency and diversity of voices. But I was really encouraged to hear remarks at the beginning of this meeting saying that additional meetings will be added, and hopefully a deeper and broader and more intentional outreach can be done to create better community engagement. It's my hope that the members of this body, this working group on transformational criminal and juvenile justice, will uphold all that your name implies. Transformation is the operative word here. In that aspirational word, there's a recognition that our current system needs deep structural change. Are we committed to that? And is that the goal behind seating this working group? If not, can we reorient so it does become the goal? Many good pieces of legislation sprang from the TCJJ, but from what I have observed and from having listened here today, I don't think anyone would describe its 16-year history as facilitative of deep structural change. And I hope that what comes out of this working group is something designed from the start to be truly transformational, with impacted community at the table, and where communities who are most affected, that really centers people with lived experience as experts. Thanks.
Thank you. Any questions?
I do have one, and I'm going to ask you a hard question.
Yeah, I'm ready.
Okay? Because it's one that Mr. Rains and I struggle with. What do you mean by community? Because community doesn't always want reform. If you talk about community, it can be people who want longer sentences. It can be people who we don't necessarily, I'm a defender. I don't see the benefit of 36-year prison stays, but there are community that would say the exact opposite of that. There is community that says the most important thing is to increase penalties for auto theft. There is community that says nobody should be released on a personal recognizance bond. So when you talk about community, and open your mind to that and community engagement, I assume that you mean all community, which may not be the reformed community.
Certainly. And I think when I'm talking about, well, number one, I think if you are creating a body that's dedicated to transformational, reform of the criminal legal system, obviously you want to be very mindful that it needs to be evidence-based and not just based on people's biases here and there. And you also, when I'm talking about community, I'm talking about community that's impacted the most, because we know that the criminal legal system is very inequitable. So how do we go about engaging the community that's really impacted to start to change that? And that's something that's just been really obviously hard to do in the history of criminal legal reform. Those inequalities really persist. So are we getting to those folks who wouldn't come to a meeting like that? I think those people who are like, we want stronger sentences, we want this, that, and the other, they come here. They come to the legislature. We see them a lot. The people that we don't hear from is who we need to be going after. The most impacted communities.
I want to follow up a little on that last comment, and I'm not trying to. I'm really not trying to push the teeter-totter either way here, but just as folks impacted by being accused, arrested, charged, convicted, similarly, folks who have been victims don't like to come forward. They're just as intimidated by the system.
Oh, 100%.
And I think to follow up on Maureen's statement, how do we? You got to balance that when you talk about community. No one side gets to rule the day.
And I don't think that the dichotomy here is people who want reform and victims, because I personally know of so many victims who also want reform, right? The victim community has just a broad range of opinions and knowledge to share about their experience. As any other impacted.
Right. And I think the lived experience community is similar too.
Sure.
Right.
Oh, absolutely. It's really broad.
It's just how to do it.
Yeah. Again, that same recommendation about going out into community rather than having folks come in. I think you'll find the same situation with the victims, is that makes it much easier for them as well. Yeah.
Mr. Vice Chair, I'm afraid I'm going to have to pause this here. We're about 5 minutes over on this one. It sounds like we've got a number of folks, though, that we could have some follow-up conversations with, particularly on meeting groups where they are and making sure there's better awareness and engagement.
Right.
Maureen, did you want to try to get another one in? We have one more?
Yeah, we have one more, Dana, and she's been here for a while. So let's do that, and then we can take a break. Thanks, Dana Steiner, sorry.
All right, good morning, everyone. My name is Dana Steiner. I do use they, them pronouns when I prefer to use the honorific mix. I'm here today as policy counsel of Colorado Freedom Fund, and also personally as a survivor of rape and intimate partner violence. Before starting to work for Colorado Freedom Fund in 2021, even though I was a law school graduate with a ton of passion for changing our criminal legal system and someone with lived experience I believe is valuable to these conversations, I'm also one of those folks that did not know the CCJJ existed. Once I started my job at Colorado Freedom Fund, I did get familiar with the CCJJ and how it had become a bottleneck rather than a catalyst for community-supported change. And as you all have heard here today, the CCJJ was fairly inaccessible and had little engagement from Coloradans at large. We supported sunsetting the CCJJ at Colorado Freedom Fund because we knew it had outlived its most useful functions and that there are better ways to engage the community other than a permanent multidisciplinary entity. So when we learned that this working group had been created with the explicit goal to make recommendations for another permanent multidisciplinary entity, we were struck by the similarities and between the instructions given to this group and the CCJJ. I know that every single one of you is committed to involving the community. I have heard it today in the way you've engaged with the presenters and asked questions, and thank you for that. Despite this commitment, it does appear that features of the CCJJ that limited public participation have been replicated in this structure and the directions provided for this group. We know that it wasn't a strong suit of the CCJJ, which means we need to make dramatic changes. And that means really listening, taking in what people have presented on today. So there are, I will speak briefly. I know a lot of other folks have as well. Through its entire existence, there were a lot of obstacles in participating to the CCJJ, and that is true to any permanent working group or commission. We've heard about how little incentive there is to participate in a permanent standing group that has an unfocused goal of generally improving safety. And as folks have said today, people are impacted and have experience with more specific sets of issues within the criminal legal system: reentry, conditions of juvenile incarceration, pretrial reform, sentencing. And as you know, the list goes on and on. If this working group heeds the cautionary tale of the end of the CCJJ and moves forward with recommending more specific time-bound groups, there are still structural changes that community members have asked for today and outside of this meeting. So what would make people want to participate in these conversations? I'm going to sum up some of what I've heard today from presenters, as well as things that we've heard from reaching out to other people in advance of today. If some of these things sound like big asks or unreasonable tasks, I'll remind the working group that genuinely seeking public input requires dramatic change from how things have been done. And also, although some of these features have never been provided by the state of Colorado before, your working group could and should be the first to make those recommendations. You heard Mr. Johnson, Ms. Harris, Ms. Kraft, and others talk about accessible meetings. Accessible meetings means going to where and when community is available. True hybrid participation is also another aspect of accessibility that is critical. This does mean having American Sign Language interpreters, providing closed captioning services and translation services, as other governmental agencies do, just not on these working groups. This means that fully participating and engaging folks means intentional, thoughtful design, and that takes time, that takes effort, and it takes heart. Hybrid participation isn't the best for everyone, and you may not have heard this proposal, but paying for people to be transported to a meeting that is in person, even when they're coming from a place we may think of as a far-off place. If that sounds like a heavy investment for the state, I'd ask you to consider how heavy an investment it would be for the individual. Publicizing these meetings and maintaining a website so that people who can't attend meetings can still keep up with the progress and participate asynchronously is another way to increase community engagement. And this will require a lot of change and planning. As an example, as Ms. Dillon did mention, the webpage for this working group is difficult to find. When I was able to find it and then backtrack how to find it, it is buried in the Division of Criminal Justice website under the Boards and Commission menu. I was looking for something called a working group or a task force, and then it has an unfamiliar acronym TCJJ, which if I wasn't familiar with this group, I would have no idea what it was referring to. So I'm unaware of specific outreach to the public for participation in this in today's meeting. And as far as I know, the testimony today was organized by small local nonprofit organizations that do not have seats on the working group. This is not to say that nonprofit organizations can or should provide all the outreach necessary. Direct public outreach is critical. So these are investments worth making, and they are investments. Each and every community member that is able to participate because of these accommodations provides invaluable expertise. The expertise isn't diminished because someone lives on the Western Slope, and it's certainly not diminished because they work a 9-to-5 job. Community members want and deserve evidence that they are being listened to, making sure that their time isn't wasted. And as you heard Ms. Kraft say, impacted Coloradans want to be a part of a critical mass that builds consensus, not to be tokenized. This is where I'll talk a little bit more from my perspective as a survivor. Victims and survivors are not a monolith. As you know, no group is a monolith, which means they can't be represented by 1, 2, 3, or even 5 people. In fact, one of the ways I've heard this best said is by Representative Weissman. And I've heard him say many times, if you've talked to one survivor, you've talked to exactly one survivor. As I sit here today, I certainly won't profess to speak for all survivors, and asking 1 or 3 on a commission to do the same is unreasonable and bound to reduce the complexity of our experiences and the nuance of our ideas for a better world. So what would make me want to participate as a survivor? Knowing that I wouldn't stand alone. Knowing that when I show up to a meeting, I won't be the only person speaking from a place of survivorship, or 1 or 2 people speaking from survivorship. Another thing that would facilitate my participation is knowing that everyone there is working for change rather than the status quo, because the status quo created conditions and behaviors that harmed me. I'll reiterate something Dr. Brockes said today that we heard also from other folks. People who participate and share some of their most difficult moments deserve to know that their voices matter and that what they said, at least collectively, makes a difference. It's not easy or necessarily pleasant to sit in a big fancy room and speak to a group of people I have never met before about abuse that I've endured, or more often for me, about the ways that systems have failed me while trying to escape abuse. With strict time limits, that means people like myself are forced to distill our entire lives, all our expertise, criticisms, and ideas into an elevator pitch. And I will say thank you for the extended time today. This is the longest I've ever been afforded to testify anywhere. Being heard and being listened to feel very different. For people like me and the people who care deeply enough to overcome the obstacles to participation and show up in these spaces, as Ms. Dillon noted, we know when things continue along the same track they were already set for, despite our outcries and advocacy. I would encourage everyone here to begin thinking of all the public comments you heard today as testimony from people who are indeed experts on their own lived experience. Truly creating an ethic that is responsive to community input will take a lot of work, but again, it's worth it. I'm sorry to say that the way this working group has started does not seem to reflect the dramatic changes we need. We know folks are trying their best under a really short time frame, but we need to do better for Colorado and truly transform our process for decision-making in the criminal legal system. I'd encourage this group to move in a different direction, away from something like the permanent broad-based structure of the TCJJ and towards temporary focused groups you heard people advocate for. Thank you.
Thank you for everything you shared.
Thank you, Ms. Stein. Appreciate it. Rep. Weissman, yeah.
Thank you, chairs. I'm mindful I'm between the committee and its break. First of all, Ms. Steiner, thank you. It's one thing to come in and talk about policy, and we know that you do that too. It's another thing to come in and channel really difficult personal experience as you did and a prior witness did, and that has a way of stirring things up. And it's a risk that I know that you and others who do it take advisedly. As far as the impact that survivor testimony can have, when I came in here in 17, I would use the word victim, and it took me a session or two and a lot of bills to understand the very strong preference for the word survivor from community members and the why. And I have taken that to heart, and I don't use the V word outside of the Victim Rights Act or amendment, where it's sort of a term of art. I've even taken to the microphone upstairs to try to unpack that for my colleagues because I think it's important. At any rate, to the point of accessibility, I mean, I was somebody who urged early that there be a website or at least a page, and there is now, and I appreciate that the folks at DCJ have stood that up. We did have a little bit of a kind of a last scramble to get this room. We had been over there. The rooms were booked. I got this room last week. Thank you to IT staff for setting up the Zoom and being here to keep it running. I will volunteer myself to work with our chairs and facilitators as far as pinning down the next rooms as far in advance as we can, getting them on the website as far in advance as we can. And one agency or the other will set up the Zoom link. I do think it matters to have that out there for members of the general public in advance. Also, because the web page is a bit of a mouthful, the URL right now, and at the risk of setting some procurement people, to my amazement, the domain tcjj.org has not already been bought on the internet in 30 years of the web. So I just bought it and pointed it to the webpage for DCJ while we're sitting here. Now those things take 24 hours or maybe 48 to update, but the point there being, not that this solves all the things, but the point there being there's at least a more mnemonic web address for folks to go find out what all we're doing here. So when that is live, I'll let the chairs and the facilitators know, and I'm happy to work with the IT people at DCJ as far as if it's better that it goes somewhere else, that's great too, but just so that you don't even I can't memorize that URL that we have now. So a short one is generally better. And I wanted to.
Thank you, Rep. Wiseman. That is the exact type of thoughtful consideration that we're looking for, and action, quick action. Thank you.
I got a question for you. Individuals and survivors of trauma have valuable knowledge on how to address things. But oftentimes when survivors of trauma have to retell their story, it re-traumatizes them. So as we move forward in an effort to be inclusive and not exclusive, would it be, could you give some kind of insight on how we could be more inclusive of survivors' voices? I've heard some say, written testimony would probably be the best way, and if you have some other insight outside of that, like, can you just, share for the record what's on your mind with regard to that?
I would agree with that, Dr. Lester. And I would say that hybrid participation as well as written participation are helpful. So it wasn't the very first time that I gave testimony because that was before COVID. But once COVID started, a hybrid testimony became a lot more popular, and I was able to use that for some of the most difficult testimony that I've provided. And so I think also allowing flexibility and making that flexibility known in advance to folks. So for instance, today I know it's a Zoom meeting. I know I can pop on if I didn't want to be here in person. Am I going to be required to turn my camera on? I don't know. Am I allowed to participate as an anonymous person? Especially because Colorado is a big state and a small town. And so a lot of folks who have caused harm and have received harm are in some of these same spaces, right? Even if they have the same goals, that doesn't mean that I want to be forthright specifically about being in that space with them. And so am I allowed to appear as DS? Am I allowed to appear with my camera off? And just having really clear expectations. I think noting that it's okay to come in as a witness and sit in the back or appear late if they need to. Having all of these things out really decreases my personal anxiety. And the way that I have been able to do that is only with experience and with a lovely guiding hand of colleagues and other fellow advocates that have shown me these things and taught me them over time. I think that there's a pretty quick how-to that we could come up with to help people have expectations before they come and share things.
And Dana, you're not seeing it, but you've got several members who are online and are thanking you for coming forward and for your testimony.
Thank you all. Thanks, Ms. Steiner.
So Maureen, I know we're a few behind.
Yes.
I'm going to suggest we take an abbreviated 5-minute break and then come back and dig into our work going forward.
Is that okay with everybody? 5 to 7 minutes. Okay.
12:14. We'll aim for 12:20.
Okay. Thanks.
Forward. we are going to do an abbreviated version of what had been on the agenda. And I want this to be, frankly, an open flowing conversation. And we're going to react to where you are in what work we need to get done between now and next week and now and January. But there's some big questions that we need to contemplate as a working group, and then that we need input from you as your facilitators. When you look at the scope of issues this group is asked to weigh in on, it's not just the simplistic, should there be one or two entities? As we've started to tease out from Jack's testimony this morning, our quick look at states and what we heard from a number of individuals, one or two entities can look a lot different when we're talking about single focus task forces, subcommittees, different groups. So this group needs to think through what is the form that makes sense. And I would encourage us really to think of what is the function we're trying to accomplish. And when you look at the agenda, we lay out the questions of mission, of membership structure, of that informing whether there are single or multiple entities, things like the independence and the transparency, and then obviously where this gets housed. So my two big questions, and this is where I'm going to combine two sections here, is going to be one, what is the sequencing of the conversations you all feel you need to tackle to be able to have the next conversation? And by that, I mean, is it mission first? Is it structure first? Is it membership first? Is it number of entities first? What do you feel like you need to dig into as a group and put the thoughts and the ideas on the table? And then part two of my question is going to be, what do you need us to bring to you more of, to learn more about, folks you need to hear from, whether that's the experience of folks with different entities in different states or more individuals to testify? So two questions, pretty open, and I want to make sure our folks online jump in as well. What, if any, sequencing ideas do you have in terms of topics saying we've got to get to this first? And what do you need to learn, hear, or do to get there? I will also remind members of the public, we are holding more time at 12:45 for any members of the public who would like to offer their brief thoughts to the working group. But first, to everybody online and in this group, your thoughts when you look at the full spectrum of issues this group needs to make recommendations on. Are there things that you feel like you want to dig into? Janet, I'll go to you first. I'm going to keep looking online as well.
Thank you. I don't think we can answer membership until we've answered mission, and mission probably drives structure in my view. With regard to help from facilitator going forward, I think it depends very much on how we define mission. And I appreciated the overview you gave of what other states are doing. I'd like more information about that and time to review those materials. So that would be useful for me. Thank you.
Maureen.
I kind of agree with Janet's sequence with a little bit of a change, and that's I think we have to decide on number of entities. You know, do we do the, you know, 2 entities? Are we looking at more than 2? And, you know, is 1 juvenile enough? Is 1 adult enough? Those kinds of things in light of the testimony today, because once we decide that, then we go to mission. With mission, we go to membership, and then we go to structure. And you know, what we put in, what's above the line, what's below the line. I mean, we make recommendations, but like, what should these various groups decide internally versus what burdens are like maybe put in statute upon them, you know? So that's where I would go. I also agree. I really do want to look at more deeply into the other states. So as much as we can get about that, I think is valuable. And Tom always says we have homework to do. So we're all going to have some homework here.
I see that Senator Gonzalez has her hand up. So Senator.
Thank you. So the way that I'm thinking about this is what first in terms of mission, then how in terms of structure, then who in terms of membership, and then when and where, time limited versus long standing, locations of meetings. Thank you.
Senator, so does what kind of correlate to Maureen's methodology, one or multiple groups? That's kind of the what?
Both both the one or multiple, as well as what I heard a lot of testimony around today was this idea of, is it building the big structure that then maybe you have smaller entities that do work groups, or is it actually just building the smaller work groups that are more surgical and time limited, that come and go as we work through the different issues. I think that those questions are what we need to tackle first.
So it sounds like there's some ideas that this may be a bit of a hybrid conversation. We need to talk about what all or the entities would be addressing, and then move that into part of the conversation with what those structures are. Adrian, did you have your?
No, I would follow up on that. I agree with Senator Gonzalez, but I tend to take things up to move it operational. Like if we say multiple, single issue groups, like who decides what those single issues are? Is it the executive branch? Do we have a bill for every group? Do we have an oversight committee that then decides what the groups are? And so that's where that, maybe that's the what that Senator Gonzalez says. So what are we looking like? Because I don't know who's going to pick and choose. And is that what process decides what all these individual, or do we create them all and say, this is juvenile delinquency, or this is we create a permanent reentry, and then how do they communicate? Those kinds of things.
Can I ask Maureen, does it make sense to have first a more fundamental vision and theory of action conversation of, at the most base level, is one or two entities jumping to where we haven't even discussed yet? Do we need to talk about, is there standing entities, or is it these more topically specific? Do you feel like that? Does this group feel like you're aligned or even understand where you all are thinking as to what the intent should be?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I, like a couple of others, want to contemplate everything you gave us from the other states and think about some other models. I'm not in a landing place yet on what this should be, but I do think we can create, whether it's multiple or one with those under, but then you've got to articulate who answers to what and how.
Rep Weissman, I'm getting the sense I may be busting out chart paper and whiteboards for our next meeting and really ideating on this.
You buy those in bulk, right, Barrick? I mean, to me, it sounds premature to jump right into structure. We propose to create what, because I do think that there are some upstream steps. I think Ms. Drake put it in terms of membership, and membership assumes structure can't be answered until we figure out mission. I also want to learn from other states, and I think that we should iterate on that pretty quickly. You've done clearly a lot of work here, more than I had the ability to get into earlier this year. Let's reduce, the way my mind works is, let's get the statutory sites for what you boiled down. Let's go get all the details for those of us nerds up here who want that. And then we can learn positive and negative examples from that. I appreciate the point that some of the big work around here has sometimes happened like outside of the former TCJJ structure. SB 19108 was a good example. Now that had sort of a different, I don't know, convening entity, the CSGIO, and that begat a pretty comprehensive bipartisan bicameral bill. I appreciate the point where, where is the community, however one chooses to define that, already doing work? And I think Ms. Kane made a key point that certainly 7 years in judiciary bears up. There are communities within community, and frankly, some of them have opposing interests. I would also just note, and whatever our structure is needs to be cognizant of this. I can vouch, even in the relatively short time that I've had around here, which is a fraction of the tenure in this issue space that, say, a Mr. Hilke or a Mr. Rains or Ms. Kane or Sheriff Fitzsimons might have. What is being looked at right now, not just in this state, but in states across the country in the criminal justice policy space, does kind of come in waves, both because things are, I don't know, there are almost sort of just supervenient phenomena on top of policy discussions. Frankly, sometimes something really awful happens in the outside world. There had been discussions about the likes of what became SB 217. If there had not been a killing of Mr. Floyd in Minnesota, I doubt that we would have passed that bill at that time. So there's things like that. That's almost a bad example because it was so sort of exogenously accelerated. But I think the broader point that, you know, there are waves and things stands. I think that we've seen that, and we need to be able to have some cognizance of that. Exactly what that is, I don't presume to say yet, but you know, I've sensed it happening. What is really coming up this year in the legislature? What isn't? What has faded back, maybe after some action or some failures in prior years? And how do we react to that?
Thank you, Representative. And I'm getting the sense that we are probably going to need to have what I will call a structured, unstructured conversation that's a lot more free flowing for this group to not be confined to 30 seconds on this and 30 seconds on that. We need to really get at the heart of where we're trying to go with this.
Right. And let me I just want to point out, next meeting will be all testimony. So we really won't be diving into this until January. And I think January we will still have some testimony, although I think we're going to be diving into some substantive issues or having that free, you know, structured, unstructured. What are you thinking kind of from people, you know, after they've done their reading and they've listened to everybody and everybody's thoughts? And you know, because unlike Tom, I don't know where I land right now. I mean, I don't.
So on that, I want to push the group, and please continue to weigh in on where you think we are in terms of the sequencing. I'm hearing a general consensus, though, that we need to have that big picture of where are people fundamentally based on the input. I would love to hear from you as part of this. As Maureen said, on the 18th, that's going to be entirely hearing from folks. I'd like to hear from all of you. Are there specific folks you want to hear from? And whether they can come next week or we can gather written testimony, recorded testimony. Is there research in addition to the state research? Are there states you want to hear directly from as we continue this process right now of really learning and becoming informed so that come January, we can have that conversation based on a lot of input? What input do you want us to fill in?
Okay, so from my perspective, hearing from the survivors was very impactful for me. And I also know that a lot of them would not want to come and be here and do this in person. So some way, somehow, if we could get focus, put an emphasis on written comments, I think that we could have a scribe or someone that could read the comments, and we could take note of what they're saying. So that way it helps with time. I think that with regard to other states, you know, there are some grandiose ideas, and I wonder, did those other states feature fiscal people that happen to have fiscal knowledge, people that know how to penetrate the Medicare and Medicaid system, so that we could possibly look at how, okay, you know, and if they are participating in the juvenile justice and criminal justice conversations. Because I think that would, if they're at the table, then perhaps they could inform how to move forward in the future. And I think that, you know, we should focus on inclusion and exclusion instead of be inclusive instead of exclusive. And I don't know if we can do a Facebook post somewhere, but I think that, you know, we probably ought to like let people know that we really want to hear from you. We're not trying to be some people sitting behind, sitting on a dais in some fancy building. We are here because we want to hear from the community. I think it's often difficult to describe who the community is, because oftentimes the community is people that we don't like. Because if my opinion is my opinion, then the other person has their opinion, then essentially, oh goodness, I'm the community, and then they're saying they're the community. So we all the community. So I think that, we need to just be open the door and let people in. And then what else? I wrote it down. Oh, you said structure. I wanted to answer your question. So I think that we should listen. We need to create a mission from what we hear. Then we're going to create a structure. Then we're going to focus on membership, and then we're going to turn it into action.
Thank you very much. Victoria, please.
Just to kind of follow up on what Jason just said, I met with Miss Harris's team at Project Elevate last week, case managers and individuals who are also mentoring clients and things. We actually had a conversation about this in terms of outreach and where we would look forward to like putting, rubber meeting the road. And I have a short list of mentoring programs that all include individuals who have lived experience, who have navigated the system as well. So I'd be happy to provide that list for outreach in that very regard to identify individuals who may want to provide testimony or written or in person.
If you would send that in, that'd be great. And I don't want to overwhelm Maureen's inbox. So if you want to send it to us, we'll consolidate things and share.
Yeah, copy me on that. I got Rep. Weissman sent a name, Tristan sent a couple names that I have. So again, send the email if you have any other names as we try to figure out how many we can fit in on the 18th and how many, how many more meetings we have to schedule. Because I really, really don't want to say no at all. And I really like having enough time to really hear from people. So we're committed to that. And so we'll bring it in. And Jason, from what you're saying and what Victoria said, I think Cassie brought we know that something like 85% of the women in the criminal legal system are crime victims and survivors. The psychiatric diagnosis of the women in Department of Corrections are off the charts. And they almost bring some of those messages together, the women, the strong women who have been through every piece of our system. So I like, maybe accessing your group.
She did also, Ms. Harris did also offer to provide anybody who's available with a tour of their facility, as well as the empowerment program, not in, any time that works. So I'll send that around too, if we want to coordinate in the future, if anyone's available and interested, that would provide the opportunity to also meet a lot of individuals and clients within that program that she was referring to.
Right. If you could send that around and then we'll coordinate with Maureen to see if we can't coordinate on that. I would also urge, and I want to bring Adrienne in just a second. I would urge everybody, as you think about who you're wanting to hear from, to also think about the balance of two things. One is, what is it you're hoping to learn from them? Not which answer do you want, but what are you hoping to learn from them, while also giving room for them to bring you information that you didn't even know you needed to hear. But I think with our limited time, it's really important to focus on what are you looking to learn to be able to make the decisions and recommendations this group is charged with. Ms. Sanchez.
Thank you. Again, thinking to inclusivity, I can offer also some written testimony from incarcerated individuals. We have a legislation on the Inside program that I'm working with in conjunction with some folks from the Corey Wise program. So I can also get some written testimony from incarcerated individuals, and we have both females and males in that spectrum to provide some background using the prompts. And similarly, we always enjoy having folks come visit our facilities. So to the extent that that's useful, we would offer that as well. In terms of structure, I guess I would add, I'm a little bit torn process-wise between whether mission comes first or structure comes first, because I think we need to have a feel for what this group thinks a structure could look like or should look like before we can really focus on what the overarching missions could be or mission. If we don't have a clear objective or a clear idea of where we're going structurally, it's hard to plan out what a mission might be.
Thank you. Number of different things. First, I appreciate Dr. Lester's comments a few occasions now about just giving options to survivors so they don't have to come in here and speak in person in an identified way if they would prefer to not do that. I think that we need a mechanism for submission of written testimony from members of the public. I think we could attach some suggested, guidance to it. This is about structure, not substantive law. I think we should allow it. I'm imagining a form. Maybe it is nothing more than a Google form. We should allow people to provide their name and contact information or not, understanding nobody can follow up with them if they choose to be anonymous, but that's okay. I don't know what tools TCJJ has at its disposal. Mr. Reed informed me it's their PIO who updates at least that webpage. I mean, we have to move quickly here. I'm a fan of the least complexity that gets it done. And frankly, Google's made it pretty quick and easy for all of us. So there's that. I think that Ms. Terranova has gotten ahead of me, which is wonderful in talking to Ms. Harris earlier. I had traded cards with her about the idea of setting up a time to take her up on the offer for some of us, maybe outside of the formality of one of these meetings, to go and basically have a listening session. They're not too far from here, 42nd and Kearney, I think. I was going to email her, see what is workable on her end. And I don't know, I could go back to the chairs with some options. My thought is maybe that works for some of us. I know it doesn't work for all of us. Sheriff, I know you got to roll down the hill and it's not. Okay. So we'll see how that goes. And then Ms. Sanchez, I appreciate your comments too. I appreciate hearing of that program, which has been an effort of yours to stand up in this context. And I would like to underline and support that. And as to what folks in that program say and how we might, to Mr. Abramson's question, what are we looking to hear about? Specifically for folks who have system experience, one thing, I guess the first thing is I want to hear whatever is most on the minds of those folks to say. But if I were to propose a framework, it would be from the standpoint that once somebody has been system involved once, I think we would all agree that we would all like that to be the last time. So then in terms of involvement with the system, whether it was going all the way inside or a diversionary dispo or anything in the middle, what that the system did most helped you work on issues that you had driving you to what you did or coincident with what you did. And then frankly, what didn't. Okay, I diverged into substantive policy, but as far as how to learn from folks who have things to teach us, that's what's on my mind.
Thank you. And as we're coming up on 12:45, I do want to just look to our screen. And if there are members of the public who want to take advantage of the opportunity to speak briefly to the working group, if you would drop a note in the chat so that we know we've got somebody interested in public comment. Otherwise, and until I see that, we're going to continue this conversation among the working group of things like, who do you need to hear from? What do you need to learn about? And how can we best support you, knowing that our next meeting really will be more learning and hearing? But we want to look forward to January to positioning this group as best possible to start these meaningful conversations around mission, vision, structure, membership, agency, authority, and housing. Yes, sir.
I'd like to see more information on what's working globally, like in other countries and not just in the United States. As far as mission and structure, I think we're going to be discussing both of them simultaneously because some of us want one or the other. And so it looks like we'll be kind of grouping those together, and that's okay. It doesn't really bother me which one comes first. But as far as like what we need to focus on missionally, is it a consensus that we're focused on recidivism, decarceration, involving the community more, making sure that we're serving the population that doesn't have a voice. I think that's what we're hearing most. And I just want everybody to know that that's where my main focus will be, being that I come from a position of being a survivor, and then also being on that other side and being incarcerated because I was causing harm. And I just want us to make sure that we focus on the community for sure.
Understood. And I think you're right. I think there's some conversations we can facilitate that bring out both the vision and the mission and the purpose, and really seeing where everybody sees that. I see Ms. Hunter Holland has your hand up online. Please jump in, and then I'm going to go to Senator Gardner.
Thank you. This is all real new to me, not even really having a background in CCJJ. So the more I learn about a lot of things, the better off I will be. And that's pretty broad, but I don't think that affects most of the working group. So maybe just providing some additional reading sources to just give me a little more experience or knowledge about what we're really supposed to be doing, because I'm not sure I know. Is
We
that
can definitely put together some fact sheets and some historic documents. If you want pre-reading, we'll provide both the short version and the long holiday extended reading if you'd like. Senator Gardner, please.
Thank you. It is really important and this is Bob Gardner's view, but it is really important that we stay highly focused on the mission and the structure, who is going to participate, if there is a structure, how it functions and so forth, who should be at the table, and not on any particular policy outcome, or to some extent, any particular policy subject. Because I would anticipate, others obviously will disagree, but I would envision that what we're doing here is coming up with the mission and the recommended structure for a policy group, commission, call it anything that you might. Even that might represent a policy or value choice, but concentrating on what this entity or entities that we recommend, and if they are adopted, will then sit down to make all of these policy recommendations and choices, evidence-based and so forth. I have felt like today we have at times had testimony very focused on that, and at other times, and we want to hear from everyone and their concerns, but that it has bled over into the notion of what policies ought to be, or policy outcomes. The mission, I would hope, is not to reach any particular policy outcome, but to make, after study, recommendation, input, and more public testimony, make recommendations for what policies are going to best serve the entire state of Colorado. And when I say the entire state, that means offenders, that means victims, that means the public, that means the system, and so forth. So just a particular view after hearing things today about where we ought to focus. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator. I'm going to ask a question. I'm also going to pre-warn Sheriff and Director Hilke and Vincent. I want to make sure everybody has an opportunity to jump in if you'd like. I also just want to ask briefly, in addition to a more detailed look at the state matrix, would it be helpful to this group to see included in that what the purpose or mission is that's been articulated by each of those other states? We will pull that together.
Yeah.
And I'm not putting you all guys on the spot who haven't spoken. I just want to make sure everybody has the opportunity.
Right. Yeah, because, I'm sorry, Jamie. I was just going to say, as we say, we're talking about whose voices should be there, and that's been a lot of the testimony. One of the witnesses said that, the mental health and behavioral health issues that as they intersect with this system are off the charts. And I think that the awareness of that and then the budget of Adrian's budget, should we keep growing it? Those are things that do they go in the mission or not go in the mission? So I think we have to open our brains to that, and not what voice, we've been talking a lot about the voices, but we do have to have some ideas. Yeah.
Sheriff, did you want to jump in?
Only if Maureen's done.
Yeah, I'm done.
Okay. Thanks. Looking at it, I had mission, and then the structure and then membership. It's just the way my brain thinks. And then also especially after the testimony, I'm really interested in this community engagement piece and how do we best. I don't think Lester's or Jason's idea is not too bad about social media. I mean, I don't know what the mechanism is, but I mean, I think we heard it loud and clear today that the community, whichever community, doesn't feel that we're engaged or TCJJ was engaged. And I don't think we should hear that. I think we should hear that loud and clear.
Given that that's a lot of the work that our firm does, we'd be happy to bring you some ideas and reach out to those members and facilitate a dedicated conversation about how to approach it in this work and what role it may have in the entities going forward.
And I also love the idea, of taking the meeting to where the people are. Adrian, please.
I was just going to add that I think incorporating community is potentially a discussion for structure. And, that where piece and what does the structure look like, that bringing the meeting to the people piece, I heard that loud and clear. And that could be a potential discussion in structure, I think.
Understood.
Yeah, I'm intrigued by bringing it to the people. But we've got to be careful to get all the people. It can't be Metro, Colorado Springs. It just can't be that singular.
You know what? Carrie and I work with you and Maureen on kind of a whole spectrum of ideas, and then support you all in having conversations about what does engagement with the community look like for this body making recommendations, and what role does community involvement play in the ultimate structure that you recommend. Is there anybody else who hasn't spoken who wants to weigh in? Strategy.
Hi, thanks. Yeah, I'll just say, one of the things I heard and appreciated from some of the witnesses today was about evidence-based decision-making. And, we've had a lot of conversation and mention about need for reform and understanding that there's a lot of prevalence of unmet behavioral health need and traumatic brain injury and a variety of other things in the system. But it's elusive to get the evidence in front of our eyes. And I think it would be helpful to have some data overview to look at so that we can circle things and that are problematic that we're aiming to reform across demographics and overrepresentation of certain classes of individuals and things like that. So more evidence in front of us as a working group.
The only thing I would add is it's a little bit responsive to Maureen's question to one of the presenters towards the end about whose community, and making sure that we at least invite the communities that we're aware of that are not here to be here if they want to be, and if they choose not to be, then okay. But the survivor group, the law enforcement, the prosecutors, the other side that. I would disagree with one of the comments is that they often show up. I feel like they don't show up as well. And so I think it would be good to make sure that we do our best effort to reach out to all communities, including the people with lived experience and who have been impacted, as well as those people that have to execute the missions within their government jobs as well, or whatever that might be, or whether they're a nonprofit that supports, different aspects of the community. I feel like we should get more diversity.
I have Stan, Maureen and I in our limited spheres of influence. She's been reaching out to folks, which is why a lot of people showed up today. I've reached out to kind of the usual suspects on, I guess, what people would say my side of the table might be. So we're doing our best to push it out, and hopefully as the web page increases, or we do some of these other ideas that Mike's thrown out there. But I did send an invite to CML, CCI, sheriffs, chiefs, COVA. I'm missing 3 or 4, but I blasted a few entities.
And I can confirm CML has some folks online listening. We'll see what goes forward. I know we are coming right up at time. Did you want to jump in, sir?
Yeah, just one more remark about the evidence basis. I wanted to appreciate Mr. Chavez's remark about global comparisons in other nations. I know that our nation is an outlier with regard to sentencing, as well as rates of incarceration, as well as violence. And it would be interesting to see some of the evidence about practices in corrections and justice administration in those nations.
I'm going to interject because I'm interested in that as much, if not more than many here, but that's beyond the scope. We're trying to create the groups that look at that. So I think if we can help frame the mission that would then invite that examination, that's going to be a better use of our time. Because I look at that stuff all the time. I love it. And it's fascinating. Cultural differences play, all of it. But that's kind of too much for us to bite off, I think, Vincent.
I'm going to go to the sheriff, and then I'm going to throw it back to the chair and vice chair to close us out with what we need to do between now and next Monday.
This is just a quick community engagement piece. Thinking about what Jason said about social media, we all have social media and social media contacts. What if I don't know if you guys could create a graphic for every meeting that could be shared on social media and given to the members here that can share it widely with their social media. Like, for instance, I'll use me in Summit County. I could share it with all my nonprofits, law enforcement, radio stations, a newspaper. I mean, you name it. I could share it with so many people. Seesaw could share it across the state with, I'm just saying, if we created a graphic that could be shared about the next meeting.
Make it happen. That's what y'all want. We'll make it.
If you want me to share it, Jamie, you're going to also have to get all my granddaughter's pictures too. So
we are at time. So I'm going to ask the chair and vice chair to close us out, and just quickly with any notes of asks of the members between now and next meeting, or what to expect next week.
Okay. Well, it's next Monday. We are scheduled to be back across the street because this was very presumptuous of us to be sitting around this table. I mean, Rep. Weissman is used to it, but none of the rest of us are. So we are back there and have scheduled out. It was Judicial had their Christmas party in all of the training rooms today, so we couldn't be over there. So they blocked it out probably a year ago. So to celebrate, I thought it was early drinking, but day drinking is popular, I guess. Anyway, judges, yeah, just judges. Anyway, we are testimony next meeting. Again, send any names. And we'll keep working on getting the stuff posted on the website, getting the word out. We have a few more months, but anything you can start to read would be helpful. There's some things already posted, but we'll post anything given to us.
Yeah, no, I think that was great. And I will invoke the time to do homework phrase. I really appreciate what Ubaldo said about themes that he recognized during the presentations. I think that would be something we could all accomplish by next Monday, is to try and identify the 5 or 6 most salient themes, separating from individual policy desires, which obviously you can't help but weave that in. We all have them, but try and focus on those broader themes that were either good or bad, or things that folks would like to see would be helpful, as well as looking at what Barrick and Carrie have provided us so far on potential structures and mission statements, and just start noodling that stuff, because we'll be listening to 4 hours of more things that will give us more themes, undoubtedly.
It's 1:02, so we will see everybody same back channel 7 days from now down the street.
And if anybody from Wyoming is listening, we want to apologize to the state of Wyoming.
We meant so. Oh, Lord.
Okay. Did you get